You're nothing but trash.
Check the signature.
Wait, that's your name. These layoffs are necessary. Then explain these expenses.
Claire, answer her.
Ruth is the controlling owner.
She approved my paychecks?
Every one of them.
You're nothing but trash, Claire Whitcomb said, her voice slicing through the marble lobby as every employee in Hartwell Senior Living turned to stare. Ruth Hartwell was still in her gray maintenance smock, one hand gripping a cart of folded linens, the other hiding the tremor left from her recent shoulder surgery. Her son Daniel stood beside Claire and said nothing. Claire smiled like she had won. She had no idea the payroll envelope in her designer purse, the car allowance she charged to corporate, and the bonus she bragged about all carried the same quiet authorization. Ruth's signature, and this time Ruth was done disappearing. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 weeks earlier, Ruth had still believed silence was a form of love. She arrived at Hartwell Senior Living before sunrise, while the parking lot lights still glowed against the cold Ohio morning. The building looked peaceful from the outside, all soft brick wide windows and carefully trimmed hedges. It was the kind of place families trusted when someone they loved needed recovery, support, or dignity in the later years of life. Ruth paused beside her old blue Subaru and looked up at the sign. Hartwell Senior Living. Her last name was written in brushed steel above the entrance, but almost no one inside knew that. To most of the staff, she was Ruth Vale, a part-time maintenance and laundry assistant who came in early, kept her head down, and never complained. That arrangement had once felt comforting. Now it felt dangerous. Her left shoulder still ached when she lifted anything heavier than a stack of towels. The surgery had been 6 weeks ago, and her physical therapist had warned her not to overdo it. Ruth had nodded politely, then returned to work sooner than she should have, not because she needed the paycheck. She didn't. Not in the way people assumed. She returned because grief had made her restless, and because she wanted to know what had become of the company she and Harold had built. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh coffee. A night attendant waved from the desk. "Morning, Ruth." "Morning, Keisha," Ruth said softly. She liked Keisha. She liked most of the staff. They were tired, underpaid, and still kind. That mattered to Ruth more than glossy brochures ever had. She moved through the side corridor toward the laundry room, careful not to swing her shoulder too quickly. The gray maintenance smock pulled tight across her back. Her name tag said Ruth V. No one had asked what the V stood for. That was how she wanted it. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. In the laundry room, Eddie from facilities was sorting clean sheets into metal bins. He was in his late 50s, with a bad knee and a habit of humming old Motown songs under his breath. When he saw Ruth, he frowned. "You're early again." "So are you. I didn't just have surgery." Ruth gave him a small smile. "It was my shoulder, Eddie, not my brain." He laughed, but his eyes stayed worried. "You hear from your son lately?" Ruth reached for a stack of folded washcloths and paused just long enough for the silence to answer for her. Daniel had called twice since her surgery. Both times, the conversations had lasted less than 5 minutes. The first call had come while he was walking into a meeting. The second had come from his car, with Claire's voice murmuring in the background, reminding him they were late for dinner with investors. He had sent flowers after the operation. White lilies in a glass vase, expensive, beautiful, completely useless when Ruth couldn't open a medicine bottle with one hand. "He's busy," Ruth said. Eddie didn't answer. Kind people often knew when not to push. At 8:15, Ruth was restocking linen carts near the main elevator when the lobby doors opened and Claire Whitcomb swept in like the building belonged to her. She wore a camel-colored coat, high heels, and oversized sunglasses despite the gray morning. Her hair was perfect. Her smile was not. 2 assistants followed her, both carrying tablets. Daniel walked behind them in a navy suit, his phone in one hand and a paper coffee cup in the other. Ruth's heart moved before her mind did. Her son looked tired. He had Harold's eyes. That still hurt sometimes. Claire removed her sunglasses and scanned the lobby. Her expression tightened as soon as she saw Ruth. "Why is maintenance visible before the donor walkthrough?" Claire asked, not quite looking at her. Ruth kept one hand on the linen cart. "I'm restocking the West Wing." Claire's eyes flicked to Ruth's smock, then to her shoes. "The West Wing can wait." Daniel finally looked up. For one brief second, his face softened. "Mom." Claire turned sharply. The word hung there, Mom. One assistant blinked. The other pretended not to hear. Ruth saw Daniel realize his mistake. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes dropped back to his phone. Claire gave a small, controlled laugh. Daniel means Ruth. She helps out here sometimes. Helps out. Ruth felt the words settle in her chest like cold water. She had signed the original purchase agreement for this building 26 years ago, sitting beside Harold at a scratched conference table while rain hit the windows. She had chosen the first curtains, interviewed the first caregivers, and spent nights painting office walls because they couldn't afford a full renovation crew. And now, according to Claire, she helped out. Ruth said nothing. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound private while still being heard. Ruth, we've talked about this. Front-facing areas have standards. Families come here expecting quality. I understand quality, Ruth said. Claire's smile thinned. Do you? Daniel shifted. Claire. It was barely a word, barely a protest. Claire ignored him. This is exactly what I mean, she said, turning toward her assistants. We're trying to elevate the Hartwell image, and then visitors walk in and see wrinkled uniforms, old carts, tired faces. Ruth felt Eddie stop moving behind her. She felt Keisha look up from the desk. She felt the lobby go quiet in that terrible way people did when they wanted to help but feared losing their jobs. Her shoulder began to throb. Claire looked directly at her then. You need to use the service corridor, and please don't stand near the main lobby unless someone asks you to. Ruth's fingers tightened around the cart handle. There were many things she could have said. She could have said her name was on the building. She could have said Claire's title existed only because Ruth had approved the executive restructuring Daniel requested 2 years earlier. She could have said every payroll cycle still crossed her desk through the Hartwell Family Trust, whether Claire understood that or not. Instead, Ruth breathed slowly. Of course, she said. Daniel looked at her, ashamed. That shame was not enough. Claire seemed satisfied. Good. Then she turned to Daniel and began discussing floral arrangements for the upcoming founders' dinner, as if Ruth had vanished from the room. Ruth pushed the linen cart toward the service corridor. Her legs felt steady. That surprised her. Her heart did not. In the corridor, she stopped beside a supply closet and took out her phone. For a moment, she only stared at the dark screen. Then she opened her messages. There were texts from Claire after Ruth's surgery. Can Daniel just send a car? Tonight is impossible for us. Please don't make him feel guilty. He has a lot on his plate. You need to be more realistic about what you can handle at your age. Ruth had read those messages many times. Each time she had told herself Claire was stressed, Daniel was busy, families were complicated. That morning she did something different. She saved screenshots into a folder labeled Hartwell Records. Then she locked her phone and placed it back in her pocket. It was a small act, quiet, almost invisible. But it was the first time Ruth stopped treating her pain like something she needed to hide. By noon, the donor walkthrough had ended. Claire's laugh floated through the executive hallway, polished and bright. Daniel walked beside her, nodding as she spoke. Ruth watched them from the laundry room doorway while folding towels with one careful hand. Eddie leaned toward her. You okay? Ruth looked down at the towel in her lap. I'm thinking, that's usually dangerous. This time, Ruth almost smiled. Maybe it should be. After lunch, Keisha brought a stack of internal envelopes to the back office. Payroll memos came through once a week for department supervisors to review. Ruth usually ignored them when she was working as Ruth Vale. She had learned not to touch documents that might expose who she really was. But that day, one envelope had been left on the wrong cart. Executive Compensation Adjustment, C. Whitcomb. Ruth stared at the printed label. Her pulse slowed, not quickened, slowed. She waited until the corridor was empty, then picked up the envelope and carried it into the supply room. Her shoulder protested as she closed the door, but she barely felt it. Inside was a memo confirming Claire's quarterly brand performance bonus. The amount was generous, too generous for a quarter Ruth knew had included staff complaints, overtime shortages, and delayed maintenance requests. At the bottom of the page were 3 authorization lines: Daniel Whitcomb, Operating President; Martin Reyes, Chief Financial Officer; Hartwell Family Trust Authorized Signatory. Ruth looked at the final line. Her signature had already been copied from the Trust's standing authorization file. Ruth Hartwell. For a long time she did not move. Claire had called her trash that morning. Claire had ordered her away from the lobby like an embarrassment. Claire had looked through her as if she were nothing but old fabric and tired bones. And all the while, Claire's bonus sat on a page carrying Ruth's name. Ruth folded the memo carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of her smock. Then her phone buzzed. a message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Martin Reyes. I need to speak with you before the founders' dinner. It concerns Claire's payroll approvals. Please don't sign anything else until we talk." Ruth stared at Martin Reyes's message until the screen dimmed in her hand. The supply room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Shelves of paper towels and cleaning solution boxed her in on both sides, and the folded payroll memo pressed against her ribs from the inside pocket of her smock. "Please don't sign anything else until we talk." Martin was not dramatic. In the years Ruth had known him, he had been careful, almost painfully precise. Harold used to say Martin could make bad news sound like a weather report. If he was warning her through an unplanned text message, then something inside Hartwell Senior Living had moved beyond office gossip. Ruth did not answer right away. She took a screenshot of the message and saved it into the same folder as Claire's old texts. Then she opened her email, created a draft addressed to herself, and attached the photo of the payroll memo she had just taken with trembling fingers. She did not send it from the company Wi-Fi. She waited until she stepped into the back courtyard where her phone shifted to cellular service. Only then did she press send. It was not much, a memo, a text, a few cruel messages after her surgery. But evidence had to begin somewhere, and Ruth had spent too many years letting things disappear because she wanted peace. When her shift ended, she left through the employee entrance instead of the lobby. Her shoulder ached badly by then. Every step to her Subaru pulled at the healing muscle beneath her coat. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine, her hand resting on the gear shift, her eyes fixed on the building she had once believed would carry Harold's kindness long after both of them were gone. It had been Harold's idea to make the place feel less like an institution. No harsh lights, no cold hallways, no staff who spoke to older residents as if age had erased their dignity. Ruth had agreed before he finished the sentence. Back then, Daniel had been an adult with a fresh business degree and a restless hunger to prove himself. He had admired his father then. He had listened. Ruth wondered when listening had stopped being part of leadership. Her townhouse sat 20 minutes away, on a quiet street outside Cleveland where the lawns were small, and the neighbors waved without asking questions. It was modest by choice. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a living room with Harold's old reading chair still angled toward the window. Claire had once called it sweet in a retirement brochure sort of way. Daniel had laughed too softly, then looked guilty afterward. That was Daniel lately. Guilty after. Silent during. Ruth unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was warm, but the quiet hit her first. No television, no footsteps. No Harold calling from the kitchen asking if she wanted tea, even though he already knew the answer. She hung her coat carefully because reaching too high still hurt. Then she removed the payroll memo from her smock and laid it on the kitchen table. For a long moment, she simply looked at her own signature, Ruth Hartwell. She had signed thousands of documents in her life, purchase contracts, vendor agreements, benefit renewals, trust approvals. A signature could protect people. It could also be used by others who assumed the hand behind it had grown too tired to matter. She opened the lower cabinet beside the stove and pulled out a small metal lockbox. Inside were her passport, her trust identification documents, a copy of Harold's death certificate, and the contact card for Marlene Price, the attorney who had handled their estate planning for nearly 30 years. Ruth checked each document, then added a printed copy of the payroll memo. She locked the box and carried it to the hall closet instead of returning it to the cabinet. It was a small change, but small changes were how a woman began taking her life back. Her phone buzzed again just as she sat down. This time it was Daniel. "Mom, Claire said there was some confusion at the facility today. Please don't take anything personally. She's under pressure with the founders' dinner coming up." Ruth read the message twice. Not "how is your shoulder?" Not "I'm sorry she embarrassed you." Not "I should have spoken up." Just "don't take anything personally." She typed one sentence. "I heard what she said, Daniel." She waited. 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again, then nothing. Ruth placed the phone face down on the table. That silence was an answer too. The next morning she woke before her alarm. Her shoulder was stiff and the scar beneath her sleeve felt tight. She stood in the bathroom mirror and moved her arm the way the therapist had shown her. Slowly. Carefully. Pain answered, but not sharply enough to stop her. On the counter sat a prescription bottle from the week after surgery. She remembered the discharge nurse asking who would be staying with her that first night. Daniel had promised he would. He had even squeezed Ruth's hand and said, "Don't worry, Mom. I've got you." He stayed 47 minutes. Claire had called twice from the parking lot, irritated because they were late for a donor tasting. Daniel had apologized while pulling on his coat. He had arranged a rideshare to bring soup from a restaurant and told Ruth he would check in later. He did not check in until the next afternoon. For weeks, Ruth had folded that memory into something softer. Daniel was busy. Claire was demanding. Surgery made everyone uncomfortable. But truth did not become kinder just because a mother wrapped it in excuses. At Hartwell, the morning moved strangely. People spoke in lower voices than usual. Eddie avoided the executive hallway. Keisha looked worried enough to make mistakes at the front desk. Ruth noticed because invisible people noticed everything. Near mid-morning, she was replacing batteries in a wall clock outside the staff lounge when she heard two managers inside. The door had not fully closed. "I'm telling you, it's happening before the founders' dinner," one voice said. Ruth recognized Alan from operations. Another voice answered, quieter. "Claire wants the list ready by Friday?" "Not wants." "Demands. Anyone over 55 with medical costs, attendance issues, or low brand alignment." Her words. Ruth's hand froze around the battery. "That's half the laundry team," the second manager whispered. And Eddie. "Maybe Ruth Vale too." Alan sighed. "Claire says the old guard makes the company look tired. After the dinner, she wants clean optics." Ruth stepped back from the door, her pulse steady and cold. Then Alan said the sentence that made her reach for her phone. Daniel already saw the preliminary list. He didn't object. Ruth remained motionless outside the staff lounge door. The battery she had been holding pressed into her palm so hard it left a mark. Inside the room, chairs scraped against the floor. Someone laughed nervously. The conversation moved on to scheduling and budget reports as if nothing important had been said. But something important had been said. Daniel already saw the preliminary list. He didn't object. For a few seconds, Ruth could not decide which part hurt more, the possibility that her son agreed with Claire, or the possibility that he simply did not care enough to stop her. She stepped away before anyone opened the door and saw her standing there. Her expression stayed calm. Years of disappointment had taught her how to hide pain in public, but underneath that calm, something was changing. The excuses were becoming harder to find. The rest of the shift dragged by. Ruth finished her tasks carefully, making notes in her phone whenever she found herself alone. She recorded the date, the time, the names she had heard, and the exact words used. Older employees, medical costs, low brand alignment. She saved everything. By late afternoon, she found herself in the employee cafeteria with a cup of coffee she barely touched. Across the room, Eddie sat alone. Eddie Morrison was 63 and had worked at Hartwell for nearly 14 years. He maintained equipment, fixed plumbing problems, and somehow remembered every resident's preferred chair in every common room. He looked tired, more tired than usual. Ruth watched him stare at his untouched sandwich. Finally, she crossed the room. "Eddie." He looked up and forced a smile. "Hey, Ruth? Everything okay?" The smile faded. For a moment, he seemed ready to say something. Then he shook his head, just thinking. She sat across from him. After a long silence, Eddie sighed. "Did you ever get the feeling somebody already made a decision about you before you walked into the room?" Ruth felt her stomach tighten. "What happened?" Eddie rubbed the back of his neck. "Nothing official." That answer told her everything. Nothing official yet. But something was coming. Before she could ask more, Eddie's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and immediately looked uncomfortable. "What is it?" He hesitated. "Mandatory performance review next week." Ruth stared at him. Performance reviews usually happened once a year, not suddenly, not weeks before the founders' dinner. And not only for certain employees. Eddie stood and grabbed his tray. Probably nothing. Neither of them believed that. After he left, Ruth sat alone for several minutes. Then she opened her contacts and selected a number she had not called in months. Marlene Price answered on the second ring. "Ruth, do you have time this week?" The attorney immediately heard something in her voice. "Of course. What's wrong?" Ruth glanced around the cafeteria. "Nothing I can prove yet." Yet? There was a brief silence. "When can you come in?" "Friday morning. I'll clear my schedule." Ruth ended the call feeling slightly steadier. She was not ready to reveal everything, not yet, but she was done handling every concern alone. When she arrived home that evening, another surprise waited. A large envelope sat inside her mailbox. Corporate logo, Hartwell Senior Living, her name printed beneath it. Ruth carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For several seconds, she simply looked at it, then she opened it. Inside was a formal notice, mandatory staff image review. Attendance required, business attire expected. The review would take place the following morning. Her eyes moved slowly through the page. Language about professionalism, guest experience, future brand positioning, workplace excellence. The wording sounded harmless, almost elegant. Yet every instinct told her otherwise. Halfway through the second page, she found the phrase that made her jaw tighten. Employees may be evaluated for role suitability within future organizational objectives. That was not a review. It was preparation. Preparation for removing people. Ruth immediately photographed every page. Then she forwarded the images to her personal email and printed a copy for her lockbox. By the time she finished, another text had arrived. Claire. For a moment, Ruth considered ignoring it. Then she opened it. Please arrive early tomorrow. Presentation standards will be reviewed. Staff who fail to meet updated expectations may face reassignment recommendations. No greeting, no signature, no attempt to hide the threat. Ruth stared at the screen. She could almost hear Claire's voice behind every word. The message wasn't directed only at her. It was directed at everyone Claire considered expendable: older workers, maintenance staff, laundry staff, people whose uniforms carried stains from actual work, people who made the facility function while executives gave speeches about innovation. Ruth saved the text. Then she placed the phone face down. The evening should have ended there. Instead, another call arrived. Daniel, she answered after several rings. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded cautious, almost rehearsed. Hello, Daniel. A pause, then another. Finally, he spoke. Claire mentioned the image review tomorrow. I received the notice. Try not to take it personally. The exact same phrase. Again. Ruth closed her eyes. Is that what you're calling it? What? A review. Daniel exhaled. You know, Claire, she's trying to modernize things. Modernize. Another word that seemed harmless until people started disappearing behind it. Does modernizing require targeting employees over 55? Silence, not confusion, not surprise. Silence. Ruth heard it clearly. Then Daniel spoke too quickly. I don't know where you heard that. There it was. Not that's not true. Not you're mistaken. I don't know where you heard that. A denial wrapped around an admission. Ruth felt something inside her settle into place. Not anger, not yet. Certainty. Good night, Daniel. Mom, she ended the call. For the first time in months, she did not stay on the line to make him comfortable. That boundary felt small, but it mattered. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Ruth dressed carefully, clean slacks, a simple blouse, nothing extravagant, nothing apologetic. As she prepared to leave, she checked her lockbox one final time. Documents, trust records, copies of messages, payroll memo, everything remained exactly where she had placed it. Control began with knowing what belonged to you. When she reached the facility, employees were already gathering in one of the conference rooms. The atmosphere felt wrong, too quiet, too tense. People spoke in whispers. Nobody smiled. Near the doorway, Ruth noticed Keisha from the front desk. The younger woman looked pale. Morning, Ruth said. Keisha forced a nod. Morning. Something was wrong. Before Ruth could ask, a man she recognized from Human Resources appeared beside them. His expression looked equally strained. He carried a stack of folders. One slipped slightly from the pile as he adjusted his grip. For a split second, Ruth saw the label attached to the tab. Transition Planning, Employee Separation Forecast. The folder disappeared before anyone else seemed to notice, but Ruth had seen enough. The HR employee looked around nervously. Then, as he passed Ruth, something unexpected happened. A small flash drive dropped from beneath the folders and landed near her shoe. The man kept walking. He never looked back. Ruth bent slowly, picked it up and slipped it into her pocket. A few seconds later, she looked toward the HR employee again. This time he met her eyes, only for a moment, then he gave the smallest nod and turned away. Ruth kept her face neutral as she slipped the flash drive deeper into her pocket. The HR employee disappeared into the conference room without another glance. Whatever he had just done, it had not been an accident. People did not drop storage devices full of sensitive company information in front of witnesses by mistake. Such frightened HR employees carrying folders labeled Employee Separation Forecast. The conference room doors opened. Staff members began filing inside. Ruth followed with everyone else. The room felt colder than usual. Rows of chairs faced a large presentation screen. Coffee sat untouched on a side table. Several employees exchanged nervous looks but avoided speaking too loudly. Claire stood near the front. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, perfectly confident. Daniel stood beside her holding a tablet. His expression looked tired. Claire smiled at the room. Thank you all for coming. Today's review is about excellence, growth, and ensuring Hartwell remains the premier recovery residence in the region. The language sounded polished. Ruth had spent enough years in business to recognize a dangerous presentation when she heard one. The most damaging decisions were rarely introduced with words like layoffs. They arrived disguised as progress. For nearly 40 minutes, Claire moved through slides filled with branding language, customer engagement metrics, guest-facing standards, and modernization goals. Every few minutes she used another phrase: future readiness, culture alignment, operational evolution. Not once did she say older workers. Not once did she say job cuts. Yet everyone understood. The room understood. Ruth understood. And judging from the tightness around Daniel's eyes, he understood too. Then Claire clicked to a new slide. Employee image standards. A murmur moved through the room. Photographs appeared on the screen. Staff uniforms, hair guidelines, appearance ratings, energy expectations. Some categories felt reasonable, others did not. One section included subjective ratings like vibrancy, adaptability, and future-facing presence. Ruth immediately recognized the problem. Those terms could mean almost anything, and that was exactly why they were dangerous. Claire pointed toward the screen. Our guests expect excellence. Every employee represents the Hartwell brand. Nobody responded. Claire continued. Sometimes that means difficult conversations. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed directly on Ruth, only for a second, but it was enough. The message was clear. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Ruth saw it. Claire saw it too. Neither acknowledged it. The review ended with no formal announcements, but the damage had already been done. Employees left looking shaken. Several avoided eye contact. Others looked angry. Eddie looked defeated. When Ruth finally stepped into the hallway, she heard Claire's voice behind her. Ruth, a moment. Ruth turned. Claire approached carrying a tablet. Daniel remained several feet back. As usual, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid responsibility. Claire smiled. I wanted to discuss your role. Ruth waited. We value loyalty. Claire paused. But some positions eventually become less necessary. There it is, Ruth said quietly. Claire's smile tightened. I'm talking about organizational efficiency. No, you're talking about people. For a brief second, Claire's expression hardened. Then the corporate smile returned. I think retirement might be worth considering. Ruth looked directly into her eyes. I'll decide when retirement is worth considering. The silence that followed surprised Claire. For the first time in months, Ruth had not backed away. Daniel noticed it too. His gaze shifted between them. Claire recovered quickly, just something to think about. Ruth walked away before Claire could say anything else. It was a small victory, tiny, but real. That afternoon, she finished her shift and drove home. The flash drive remained in her purse the entire time, waiting. By the time she reached her townhouse, curiosity had become urgency. She locked the front door, closed the blinds, turned on her laptop, then inserted the drive. Several folders appeared immediately: personnel reviews, workforce planning, brand restructuring, executive budget. Ruth's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, from focus. She began opening files. The first documents confirmed her suspicions. Employees over 55 had been flagged disproportionately for review. Performance concerns appeared vague: energy concerns, adaptability concerns, culture concerns. Many evaluations lacked supporting documentation. Several included identical wording copied from one file to another. Ruth photographed everything, then saved encrypted copies to an external drive. If the files disappeared later, she wanted proof they had existed. She continued digging. An hour passed. Then another. The deeper she looked, the worse it became. The workforce plans projected significant reductions among older maintenance workers, caregivers, and support staff, not because of performance, because replacing them would reduce benefit costs. Ruth leaned back in her chair, her stomach turned. These weren't numbers. She knew these people. She knew their faces, their injuries, their spouses, their medical treatments. Claire had reduced them to projected savings. Then Ruth opened another folder: executive budget. The first few pages appeared normal: marketing expenses, event spending, consulting fees. Then she noticed something strange. Several consulting invoices carried nearly identical descriptions: brand development initiative, executive image enhancement, leadership positioning strategy. The amounts were surprisingly large. She opened supporting documents: luxury hotel stays, private styling sessions, media coaching packages, personal image consulting, thousands of dollars, charged to company accounts. Ruth stared at the screen. A cold feeling settled into her chest. These weren't operational expenses. They were personal expenses. Someone had disguised them. Someone inside finance had approved them, and every approval carried an electronic authorization: Daniel Whitcomb. Ruth closed her eyes. That hurt more than she expected. Not because it proved guilt, because it proved negligence. Daniel had either approved these expenses knowingly or signed without reading them. Neither possibility made her feel better. Her phone suddenly rang. Marlene. Ruth answered immediately. You sound tired, Marlene said. I found something, good or bad. Bad. She summarized what she had seen, the layoffs, the age-targeted reviews, the questionable spending, the copied evaluations. Marlene listened carefully. When Ruth finished, silence filled the line. Finally, the attorney spoke. Save everything, I already have. Multiple copies. No, don't confront anyone. Ruth smiled faintly. You know me too well. I know you're angry. I'm not angry. That answer surprised even her. Anger wasn't the dominant emotion anymore. Disappointment was. Marlene seemed to understand. We'll review everything Friday. After hanging up, Ruth returned to the files. Near midnight, she opened one final folder, founder dinner planning. Most of it involved seating charts and event schedules. Then she found a document labeled Transition Announcement Draft. Her pulse quickened. She opened it. Several paragraphs described Hartwell's future vision, leadership modernization, operational efficiency, a new era. Then she reached a section that made her stop breathing for a moment. Legacy staffing transitions. Attached beneath it sat a list. Names, departments, projected separation timelines. Eddie's name appeared. 3 caregivers, 2 maintenance workers, several housekeepers, and near the bottom Ruth Vale, her undercover employee identity, projected removal within 30 days. The decision had already been scheduled, before any review, before any evaluation, before any legitimate process. Someone had decided her future weeks ago. Ruth stared at the screen. Then she noticed something else. A comment bubble attached to the document. Internal notes. She clicked it open. Only one sentence appeared. Proceed after founder dinner. Daniel has agreed this is the cleanest approach. For several seconds, the room felt completely silent. Ruth read the sentence again and again. Daniel has agreed. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe Claire had written it herself. Maybe Daniel had never seen the note. But one fact remained. Someone wanted people to believe he approved it. Ruth printed the page immediately, then saved screenshots and backup copies. The evidence was growing, but so were the questions. She was gathering pieces of a puzzle that still lacked a center. Just after midnight, another notification appeared on her screen. An automatically archived internal calendar invitation. The subject line froze her in place. Executive Payroll Authority Review. Scheduled 3 days after the founder's dinner. Restricted attendance. Executive leadership only. Ruth opened the details, then slowly sat back in her chair. One attendee name stood out immediately. Claire Whitcomb. Another attendee surprised her even more, a regional banking representative. And attached to the invitation was a draft document request. Authorization transition package. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Someone wasn't just planning layoffs. Someone was preparing to change who controlled the signatures. Ruth sat in front of her laptop long after the calendar invitation disappeared from the screen. The house around her was quiet. The kitchen clock ticked softly. Outside, wind moved through the bare branches near the porch. Her shoulder throbbed from sitting too long, but she barely noticed it. Authorization transition package. The word stayed in her mind. Payroll authority was not something Claire could simply take because she wanted it. The Hartwell Family Trust had procedures, corporate bylaws, banking requirements, and layers of approval. Ruth knew that better than anyone. She had helped build those protections after Harold insisted that no single executive should ever be able to drain the company or punish employees without oversight. Still, the invitation mattered. Someone was trying, and Claire had included a banking representative. Ruth opened a fresh document and typed everything she had learned. The names, the dates, the folders, the proposed staff removals, the questionable spending, the payroll authority review. She attached screenshots and saved the file in 3 places: her laptop, an external drive, and a secure cloud folder connected to a private account Daniel did not know existed. Then she changed the passwords. It took longer than expected because her hands shook more than she wanted to admit, not from fear exactly. From the strain of finally treating betrayal like something real instead of something she could forgive by pretending it hurt less. The next morning, Ruth went to her physical therapy appointment before work. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and coffee. Her therapist, Laura Chen, watched her move through the shoulder exercises and frowned. "You're overusing it. I'm careful." Laura raised an eyebrow. "That is what every stubborn patient says." Ruth tried to smile, but it did not last. Laura lowered her clipboard. "Are you getting help at home?" The question landed harder than it should have. Ruth looked at the exercise bands hanging on the wall. Not much. Laura's face softened, but she did not pity her. Ruth appreciated that. "You need support for another few weeks." Heavy lifting, long shifts, stress, all of it slows healing, I know. Knowing isn't the same as choosing differently. Ruth was quiet. Daniel had known she needed help too. He had known because the discharge nurse explained it in plain language. No driving for several days, help with medication, help with meals, help dressing if pain flared. He had nodded through all of it, then left because Claire had a dinner. Ruth signed the therapy form with her right hand, careful and slow. As she left, she asked Laura for a copy of her post-surgery restrictions and discharge recommendations. Laura printed them without question. Ruth folded the papers neatly and placed them in her purse. Evidence did not always look like a scandal. Sometimes it looked like instructions no one cared enough to follow. At Hartwell, Claire's presence filled the building before Ruth saw her. The lobby had been rearranged again. Fresh white orchids sat on the reception desk. New abstract art leaned against the wall waiting to be hung. A photographer adjusted lights near the main staircase. Claire stood at the center of it, all wearing cream trousers and a pale blue blouse. She was speaking to an event coordinator with the crisp patience of a woman barely controlling irritation. No. The florals cannot look like a hospital charity brunch. This is a premier senior recovery residence. Families need to feel aspirational comfort. Ruth entered through the side corridor, but Claire still noticed her. Of course she did. Ruth, Claire called. Several people turned. Ruth stopped. Claire walked over with a smile that belonged in photographs, not conversations. I need you to avoid the lobby for the rest of the week unless facilities specifically request you. I am facilities today, Ruth said. Claire's smile tightened. You understand what I mean. Daniel appeared near the reception desk, reviewing something on his phone. He looked up when he heard Ruth's voice. For half a second, Ruth saw conflict on his face. Then he looked back down. Claire continued, quieter now. We have media coming through, donors, potential partners, presentation matters. Ruth looked at the orchids, the stage lights, the polished stone floors. Then she looked at Claire. Work matters too. Claire blinked. It was not a sharp insult, not loud, but it landed. One of the event coordinators looked away quickly as if hiding a reaction. Claire stepped closer. You seem unusually sensitive lately. Ruth felt Daniel look up again. There it was, the old trick. If Ruth objected, she was sensitive. If she stayed quiet, Claire won. I'm not sensitive, Ruth said. I'm clear. Daniel's eyes lifted fully this time. Claire studied Ruth as if seeing a new shape in an old shadow. Good, Claire said after a beat. Then be clear enough to follow instructions. Ruth did not answer. She walked past her toward the service corridor. Behind her, Claire resumed speaking to the photographer as if nothing had happened. Her voice turned bright again. Warm, impressive, false. By lunch, Ruth found Eddie in the maintenance office trying to repair a jammed cartwheel. He was moving slower than usual. His knee had swollen visibly beneath his work pants. You should sit, Ruth said. He laughed without humor. If I sit too long, someone might decide I lack vibrancy. Ruth closed the door behind her. Eddie looked up. The joke faded. You heard something, he said. So did you. He wiped his hands on a rag. For once, he did not pretend. They scheduled my review for Monday. Keisha too. A couple caregivers. All older staff except one younger supervisor they keep using in brochures. Ruth felt her jaw tighten. Did they give reasons? Energy, flexibility, guest perception. He tossed the rag onto the desk. I've missed 3 days in 2 years. One was for a knee injection. But suddenly I'm a brand problem. Ruth sat carefully in the chair across from him. I may need you to keep copies of anything they give you. Eddie stared at her. Why? Because vague language can become dangerous when nobody challenges it. He studied her for a long moment. You sound like someone who knows more than she should. Ruth almost smiled. Maybe I do. She did not say more. Not yet. That afternoon, Ruth received another text from Daniel. Can you come by tonight? Claire thinks we should talk as a family before things get uncomfortable at work. Ruth looked at the message while standing near the laundry machines. As a family. Only when they needed to manage her. She typed back. I can come for 30 minutes. His reply came quickly. Maybe don't bring up work documents. Claire is trying to keep this calm. Ruth stared at the screen. So Claire already knew Ruth had documents, or feared she did. Ruth saved the message. Then she replied, I'll decide what I bring. For several minutes, Daniel did not respond. When he finally did, his message was short. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ruth slipped the phone into her pocket. That evening, before driving to Daniel and Claire's house, she stopped at a small office supply store. She bought a new flash drive, 2 document envelopes, and a portable scanner. In the parking lot, under the yellow light of a street lamp, she scanned the therapy restrictions, the payroll memo, the staff review notice, and the transition list page with her name on it. Then she placed the originals in her lockbox at home. Copies went with her. Daniel lived in a newly built townhouse in a polished development with stone gates and identical trimmed shrubs. Ruth knew Hartwell money helped pay for the down payment, though Daniel had once called it executive housing support, as if renaming the source made it less personal. Claire opened the door before Ruth could knock twice. Her smile was controlled. "Ruth, come in." Daniel stood in the living room beside the fireplace, hands in his pockets. He looked relieved and miserable at the same time. Ruth stepped inside and immediately noticed a folder on the coffee table. Her name was typed on the tab. Ruth Hartwell, Ruth Vale. Claire saw her notice it. "We thought it would be helpful to clarify some things," Claire said. Ruth did not sit. "What things?" Claire folded her hands. "Your role, your health, your ability to continue working without creating liability." Daniel looked down. Ruth's chest tightened. Claire gestured toward the folder. "We prepared a voluntary transition agreement. Nothing hostile, just clean, respectful. You sign, take a small severance, and step away before the founder's dinner." Ruth looked at her son. "Did you prepare this?" Daniel swallowed. "Mom, it might be best." The room went very still. Ruth picked up the folder and opened it. The first page contained a resignation statement. The second included a confidentiality clause. The third required her to confirm she had no ownership, financial, or decision-making authority at Hartwell Senior Living. Ruth slowly lifted her eyes. Claire smiled. But this time Ruth saw the fear underneath it. Ruth did not speak for several seconds. The folder felt heavier than paper should have felt. She could still see the sentence on the third page, clean and legal-looking, as if it were a harmless formality. "I confirm that I hold no ownership, financial, operational, or decision-making authority in Hartwell Senior Living or any related entity." Claire had placed the lie in front of her like a cup of tea, and Daniel had stood there while she did it. Ruth looked at her son first. She needed to see his face before she answered. Daniel's eyes moved from the folder to the floor, then back to her, but he would not hold her gaze for more than a second. "Did you read this?" Ruth asked. Daniel shifted. "Mom, it's just standard language." "No," Ruth said softly. "I asked if you read it." Claire stepped in before he could answer. "Ruth, there's no need to interrogate him. This is meant to protect everyone." Ruth turned toward her. "Everyone?" "Yes. You, the company, Daniel." Claire's voice stayed smooth, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair beside her. "You've been through a lot medically. No one is blaming you. But after the incident in the lobby and your recent sensitivity, it's better to make a clean transition before things become embarrassing." There it was again. Embarrassing. Not Claire's cruelty. Not Daniel's silence. Ruth's existence. Ruth closed the folder and placed it back on the coffee table. "I'm not signing this." Daniel finally looked up. "Mom, please." The word hurt because it sounded like a son asking for help. But Ruth had learned to listen beneath tone. He was not asking her to protect herself. He was asking her to make his life easier. Claire's expression cooled. "Refusing only makes this more complicated. Then let it be complicated." For the first time that evening, Claire had no immediate answer. Ruth picked up her purse. She felt the copies of her documents inside, neatly sealed in an envelope. She had brought them in case she needed proof. Now she understood she needed something else more. Distance. Daniel followed her toward the entryway. "Mom, wait!" Ruth stopped with her hand near the door. "I don't want this to become a fight," he said. Ruth looked at him carefully. In the warm light of the townhouse, he looked older than he had a year ago. Tired. Pressured. But tired people could still choose courage. Pressured people could still tell the truth. "Then stop asking me to surrender quietly," she said. His face tightened as if she had struck him. Claire appeared behind him. "Nobody is asking you to surrender. We're asking you to be reasonable." Ruth opened the door. "No," she said. "You're asking me to disappear on paper." She left before either of them could answer. The cold air outside felt sharp in her lungs. She sat in her Subaru for a full minute before starting the engine. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, but her mind was clear, too clear to ignore. Claire had not guessed blindly. That agreement was written for a reason. Someone wanted Ruth to deny authority before the payroll review. Someone wanted a signed document that could be shown to a bank, a board, or an attorney as proof that Ruth Vale had no power. But Ruth Vale was not the problem. Ruth Hartwell was. At home, she did not take off her coat right away. She went straight to the hall closet, removed the lockbox, and placed it on the kitchen table. One by one, she took out the trust documents, Harold's death certificate, her identification, and the printed copies she had saved. Then she added a new page, a photograph of the voluntary transition agreement. She had taken it at Daniel's house while Claire was talking. One clear picture of each page. One close shot of the clause denying ownership. One shot showing the folder tab with both of her names. Ruth connected her phone to the portable scanner and uploaded everything into her private folder. Then she finally sat down. The silence in the kitchen felt different tonight. Not lonely. Waiting, her phone buzzed. Daniel, she let it ring. A voicemail appeared 30 seconds later. She listened with the phone on speaker. Mom, I'm sorry tonight felt uncomfortable. Claire is trying to prevent a bigger problem. You know how people talk, and if staff thinks you're being mistreated, it could hurt the company. Please don't make this public. We can work something out. Just call me. Ruth saved the voicemail. Then she replayed one sentence. If staff thinks you're being mistreated, it could hurt the company. Not if you are being mistreated. If staff thinks. Even now, Daniel was managing perception. Ruth's chest ached, but she did not cry. Tears would come later, maybe. For now, she had work to do. She opened her email and wrote to Marlene Price. Urgent review tomorrow. Claire and Daniel presented a resignation confidentiality agreement requiring me to deny any ownership or financial authority. I did not sign. I have copies. She hesitated before sending the next sentence. I believe they may be preparing to alter payroll authorization or represent my authority inaccurately to the bank. Then she pressed send. The reply came within 10 minutes. Come at 8:30. Bring everything. Do not discuss this further with Daniel or Claire before we meet. Ruth read the message twice. Do not discuss. For once, advice and instinct matched perfectly. The next morning, Ruth did not go to Hartwell first. She called the facility scheduler and said she had a medical appointment. That much was true. Her shoulder did ache, and betrayal had begun to feel like a second wound under the first. Marlene Price's office sat in an older brick building near downtown Cleveland. The waiting room had green lamps, dark wood shelves, and framed certificates that had faded slightly at the edges. Ruth had been there after Harold's diagnosis, after his death, and after Daniel took over operations. Each visit had marked a version of loss. Marlene came out herself. She was 71, sharp-eyed, and dressed in a charcoal suit. She did not offer false comfort. She took one look at Ruth's face and said, "Conference room." Ruth placed everything on the table: the payroll memo, Claire's bonus authorization, the staff review notice, the transition list, the copied evaluations, the spending files, the agreement Claire had tried to make her sign. Marlene read silently. Her expression changed only once when she reached the ownership denial clause. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. "This is not standard language," she said. "I know. Who prepared it?" "I don't know." Marlene turned the page. "There's no law firm listed. No HR compliance footer. No company counsel signature. That concerns me." Ruth felt a cold pressure behind her ribs. "Could they use it? If you had signed it, they could try. Whether it would hold up is another matter, but it could create confusion. Banks hate confusion. Boards hide behind confusion. Executives use confusion." Ruth looked at the document spread across the table. "Claire doesn't know the trust structure. She knows enough to be dangerous," Marlene said. "Or someone is helping her." That possibility had already begun forming in Ruth's mind, but hearing it aloud made it heavier. Marlene opened the flash drive files on her secured office computer. She reviewed the folders slowly, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she reached the calendar invitation for the Executive Payroll Authority review, she leaned closer to the screen. "Who is the banking representative?" Ruth pointed to the name. Marlene's face changed. This time, Ruth saw it clearly. "What?" Marlene did not answer immediately. She opened a drawer, pulled out an old file, and flipped through several pages. Then she stopped. This man was copied on a rejected request last year. What request? Marlene looked up. A preliminary inquiry about whether Daniel, as operating president, could assume expanded signature control if the trust signatory became medically unavailable. Ruth went still. "Last year?" "Yes. I was not medically unavailable last year." "No," Marlene said quietly. "You were not." Ruth heard the kitchen clock in her memory, the surgery discharge papers, Claire's texts, Daniel asking her not to take things personally, the resignation clause, the payroll review. Pieces moved closer together, but not enough to complete the picture. "Who made the inquiry?" Ruth asked. Marlene looked down at the file again. Then she turned the page toward Ruth. The request had been submitted under Daniel's executive email, but the attached note was signed by Claire. Ruth looked at Claire's name on the attached note and felt something in her chest go very still. Not cold, not broken, still. For months, maybe years, she had thought Claire's cruelty came from arrogance, from image, from the sharp impatience of a woman who wanted everything around her polished. But this was not just cruelty. This was planning, quiet planning, the kind that happened in emails, calendar invitations, and careful phrases meant to sound responsible. Marlene turned the file back toward herself. "The request was rejected because the trust documents are clear," she said. Daniel cannot assume expanded signature control without either your written authorization or a documented legal incapacity process. An inquiry alone does not change anything. But they asked, yes, and no one told me. Marlene's mouth tightened. The inquiry never moved beyond preliminary review. At the time, I considered it a clumsy executive question. Now, with this agreement and the payroll meeting, it looks different. Ruth looked down at her hands. The skin was thinner than it used to be, the veins more visible. Her shoulder still ached beneath her blouse, but those hands had signed payroll for caregivers who worked double shifts. They had signed loan documents when Hartwell was still fragile. They had held Harold's hand when he made her promise not to let the company become cruel. Claire had called those hands weak. Daniel had let her. What do we do? Ruth asked. Marlene leaned back. First, we notify the bank in writing that no authority change is approved. Second, we request a full copy of any documents submitted or drafted regarding your role. Third, you do not sign anything from Daniel, Claire, HR, or anyone else without my review. Ruth nodded. Do it. Marlene studied her. Ruth, this may put you directly against your son. I think he already put himself there. The words hurt as soon as she said them. But they were true enough to remain in the room. Marlene softened, just slightly. You can still love him and protect yourself. Ruth gathered the copies into her folder. I'm trying to remember that. By the time Ruth left Marlene's office, the sky had darkened with afternoon clouds. She sat in her car and read the message that had arrived while she was inside. Daniel, can we have dinner tonight? Just us first, then Claire may join. There are investors coming through tomorrow, and I don't want tension. Ruth stared at the sentence, just us first. Then Claire may join. It sounded like an invitation. It was really a staging plan. She replied after a full minute. Where? His answer came quickly. Our place, 7 p. Please come dressed nicely. Claire wants this to feel respectful. Ruth nearly laughed, not because anything was funny. Dressed nicely, respectful. A woman could be asked to deny her authority on paper one night and dress nicely for the people doing it the next. She typed back one word, no. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then vanished, then appeared again. Mom, please! This is important! Ruth waited. Another message followed. If you refuse to participate, Claire will think you're trying to embarrass us. Ruth's fingers hovered over the screen. The old Ruth might have explained, apologized, offered another day, smoothed the edge of his discomfort until he no longer had to feel it. Instead, she wrote carefully, I will meet you in a public place for 1 hour. You may choose the restaurant. I will not discuss or sign documents. For several minutes, no response came. Then Daniel sent the name of a restaurant near the river, one Ruth recognized from Claire's social media posts. Expensive, visible, popular with executives who liked being seen. Of course. At 6:30, Ruth stood in front of her bedroom mirror. She chose a navy dress she had not worn since a board reception years earlier. Simple, well-tailored, not flashy. She brushed her silver hair back and fastened small pearl earrings Harold had given her on their anniversary. For a moment, she looked like herself again. Not Ruth Vale, not the gray smock, not the employee Claire could wave away, Ruth Hartwell. Before leaving, she placed the copied documents in a slim leather folder and set it inside her purse. She did not intend to use them. But carrying truth changed how a woman walked into a room. The restaurant glowed warm behind tall glass windows. Daniel was already seated when Ruth arrived. He stood quickly, surprise crossing his face when he saw her. Mom, he said. His voice carried something complicated. Pride, maybe, or grief. You look nice. Thank you. He waited until she sat, then looked toward the entrance. Claire is running late. I thought we were speaking first. We are. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of his water glass. I just didn't know how long you'd stay. Ruth folded her hands in her lap. 1 hour. He nodded, wounded by a boundary he had helped make necessary. For a few minutes, he talked about the founder's dinner, donor expectations, staffing pressures, the cost of renovations. He used the same careful language Claire's used, though not as smoothly. Ruth listened without interrupting. Finally, she said, have you read the separation forecast? Daniel's face tightened. That's not final. That wasn't my question. He looked away toward the windows. There was her answer. Did you read the agreement Claire gave me? I skimmed it. Then you missed the clause asking me to deny any authority at Hartwell. His eyes returned to hers quickly. Too quickly. Claire said that was just to separate your staff role from family complications. Ruth opened her purse but did not remove the folder. Is that what you believe? Daniel leaned back, exhausted. I don't know what to believe anymore. That was the most honest thing he had said in weeks. For one brief second, Ruth saw her son beneath the executive. Not innocent, not excused, but afraid. Before she could answer, Claire arrived. She wore black, sleek, and expensive, with a cream coat over her shoulders. Her smile paused when she saw Ruth. Just a flicker. Ruth caught it. Claire had expected the smock version of her, the tired version, the version who looked easier to manage. "Ruth," Claire said, "you look different." "I am the same woman." Claire sat beside Daniel and placed a leather portfolio on the table. "Good, then maybe we can speak like adults." "We can," Ruth said. "If no one asks me to sign away things they don't understand." Claire's eyes sharpened. Daniel murmured, "Mom." Ruth looked at him. "No, not tonight." The server approached, sensed the tension, and retreated after taking drink orders. Claire leaned forward slightly. "This is exactly why we're concerned. You're becoming adversarial. I'm becoming careful. Careful people don't collect documents behind their family's back." Ruth held her gaze. "Careless people sign them without reading." Daniel flinched. Claire saw it and changed direction immediately. "Daniel has carried this company while you disappeared," she said, her voice low but firm. "You can't step away for years and then suddenly interfere because you feel guilty." The words landed harder than Ruth wanted them to, because there was truth inside the cruelty. She had stepped away. Grief had made boardrooms unbearable after Harold died. She had let Daniel take more and more responsibility because she wanted him to grow, because she wanted to believe love and legacy would guide him. But absence was not the same as trust. "I did step away," Ruth said. "That was my mistake." Claire looked satisfied, as if she had won a point. Then Ruth continued, "But stepping away did not give anyone permission to rewrite my authority." Claire's smile disappeared. For the first time that night, Daniel looked fully alert. Claire's hand moved toward the portfolio. Ruth noticed. "Don't," Ruth said. Claire froze. "I said I would not discuss or sign documents tonight." "It's not for signature," Claire replied too quickly. Ruth looked at the portfolio. "Then leave it closed." Silence settled over the table. Around them, the restaurant hummed with quiet music and expensive conversation. No one nearby knew that a family was splitting open in the corner booth. No one saw a mother deciding, piece by piece, that peace was no longer worth self-erasure. Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down and his face changed. Claire noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel turned the phone slightly away. "Nothing." Ruth saw enough. The notification banner showed the subject line before the screen dimmed. Bank review moved up. "Need Ruth issue resolved before Friday." Daniel locked the phone, but Ruth had already read it. Ruth kept her eyes on Daniel's phone for 1 second longer than she should have. Bank review moved up. "Need Ruth issue resolved before Friday." The words were gone now, hidden behind the black screen, but they had already done their damage. Daniel's hand stayed over the phone as if he could cover the truth with his palm. Claire looked from Daniel to Ruth. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing," Daniel said. His voice came out too flat. Claire's expression sharpened. She knew the sound of a lie because she used lies like tools. Ruth saw it in the way Claire's shoulders changed. Just a small shift, enough to show she did not like being kept out of control. Ruth folded her napkin and placed it beside her untouched water glass. "I think we're done here." Daniel looked up quickly. "Mom, please don't leave like this." "Like what?" "Angry." Ruth stood slowly. "I'm not angry, Daniel." Claire gave a soft laugh. "Then what would you call this?" Ruth turned to her, awake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The server appeared again, noticed everyone's faces, and quietly stepped away. Daniel lowered his voice. "Can we just talk through this without making it a legal situation?" Ruth looked at him carefully. "It became a legal situation when someone asked me to sign a false statement." Claire's jaw tightened. "That document was a draft you put in front of me. It was meant to simplify things." "No, it was meant to erase things." Daniel pushed back from the table. "Mom, Claire is trying to protect the company." Ruth felt the old pain rise again, familiar and heavy. "The company from what?" she asked. "Me?" Daniel did not answer fast enough. That was answer enough. Ruth picked up her purse. "You have both made one thing very clear tonight." Claire crossed her arms. "And what is that?" "That you are afraid of what I still have the right to say no to." She walked out without waiting for them to follow. Outside, the cold air hit her face. She pulled her coat tighter and moved toward her car, but she did not leave immediately. Instead, she took out her phone and typed the subject line from Daniel's notification exactly as she remembered it. Bank review moved up. "Need Ruth issue resolved before Friday." She added the time, the restaurant name, and who was present. Then she sent it to Marlene. Her reply came before Ruth started the engine. "Call me when you get home. Do not wait until morning." Ruth drove carefully through downtown Cleveland. Headlights blurred along the wet pavement. Her shoulder ached from tension, but she kept both hands steady on the wheel. For the first time in a long while, fear and clarity existed in the same breath. She was afraid, but not confused. At home, she locked the door, placed her purse on the table, and called Marlene. The attorney answered immediately. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Ruth did. Marlene listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, there was a brief silence. Paper rustled on the other end. "I'm sending notice to the bank tonight," Marlene said. "Formal letter. No changes to payroll authority. No meetings concerning trust authorization without you or your counsel present. Can they move it up anyway? They can hold a meeting. They cannot validly transfer your authority without proper documentation. But they may be trying to create pressure, confusion, or a record that you were uncooperative." Ruth stood by the kitchen window and looked out at the dark street. "That sounds like Claire." It may not be only Claire. The sentence sat between them. Ruth already knew that. Daniel's phone had received the message. Daniel had hidden it. "Do you want me to contact Martin Reyes directly?" Marlene asked. Ruth thought of Martin's first text. "Please don't sign anything else until we talk." "Yes," she said, "but carefully. I will. In the meantime, I want you to pull any personal financial documents Daniel or Claire could access. Deeds, trust copies, account statements, medical paperwork, old powers of attorney, anything." Ruth glanced toward the hall closet. "I already moved most of them." "Good. Move the rest." After the call, Ruth did exactly that. She went through file drawers Harold had labeled years ago in his blocky handwriting. Insurance, property, medical, tax, trust. She removed anything that showed account numbers, trust authority, or property ownership. She found old bank statements in a desk drawer, a copy of Daniel's executive appointment papers, and a folder from the year Harold died. That folder slowed her down. Inside was a photograph of her and Harold standing in front of the first Hartwell building, both of them exhausted and smiling. Daniel stood beside them as an adult, wearing a suit too large in the shoulders, proud to be part of something real. Ruth touched the edge of the photo. She remembered that day clearly. Harold had told Daniel, "A company is not yours because your name is on the door. It becomes yours when the people inside trust you." Ruth closed the folder. Daniel had forgotten. Or maybe he had been trying for so long to please Claire that forgetting became easier than fighting. Near midnight, Ruth finished scanning the last documents. She placed the originals in the lockbox and moved the box to the trunk of her Subaru, not forever, just until she could place it in a safe deposit box the next morning. She slept badly. At 7:40 the next morning, she parked outside First Lake Bank, the institution that handled several Hartwell operating accounts and the trust's signature verification. She had not been inside the branch in over a year. Most business had become digital, filtered through offices, assistants, and approvals. A woman at the reception desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Ruth said. "I need to speak with someone about trust signatory protections." The woman's expression shifted at the word trust. Within 15 minutes, Ruth sat across from a senior relationship manager named Elaine Porter. Elaine was in her 50s, calm, professional, and cautious in the way bank officers became cautious when legal documents were involved. Ruth provided identification, the trust certificate copy, and Marlene's letter which had arrived in her inbox at dawn. Elaine read carefully, then read again. "I see," she said. Ruth did not rush her. Finally, Elaine looked up. "There was a request made yesterday to schedule a review of authorized payroll signatories connected to Hartwell Senior Living." Ruth's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. "Who requested it?" Elaine's expression remained professional. "It came through an executive office channel. Daniel's." The email address belonged to Mr. Whitcomb's office. Ruth held her breath. Elaine continued. "But the attached notes were prepared by Mrs. Claire Whitcomb." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. The pattern repeated. Daniel's authority, Claire's hand. Elaine slid one page across the desk. "I cannot release internal bank correspondence without formal process, but I can show you the general request summary since you are the verified trust signatory." Ruth looked down. The request summary stated that Hartwell leadership sought preliminary guidance for transitioning payroll authority due to anticipated limitations of current signatory availability. Anticipated limitations. Ruth read the phrase 3 times. They were building a story around her age, her surgery, her supposed inability. "I am available," Ruth said quietly. Elaine nodded. "Your attorney's letter now makes that clear." Ruth leaned forward. "Can any changes be made without my written consent? Not to the trust-controlled authorization structure, no, but I would still recommend placing a heightened verification flag on the account." "Do it." Elaine typed for several minutes. Ruth watched the screen reflected faintly in the woman's glasses. A line of protection appeared in a system Ruth could not see but knew mattered. Heightened verification. Manual review required. No authority transition without trust signatory and counsel confirmation. For the first time in days, the balance shifted slightly back toward her. Ruth left the bank with a stamped confirmation letter and placed it in her purse like armor. But when she reached her car, her phone buzzed with a new email. Subject: Founders Dinner Program Final Proof. It had been sent to several staff members by mistake, including Ruth Vale. She opened it in the driver's seat. The program was elegant, full of glossy language and photographs of the redesigned lobby. Claire's name appeared under the keynotes section, Claire Whitcomb, leading Hartwell into its next era. Daniel's name appeared beneath hers. Ruth scrolled lower, then her breath caught. A section near the end announced a special presentation, Retiring the Past, a tribute to legacy service. Beneath it was a list of names: Eddie Morrison, Keisha Grant, 3 caregivers, 2 laundry employees, and Ruth Vale. Ruth stared at the screen. They were not just planning to remove them, they were planning to applaud while doing it. Ruth sat in her car outside First Lake Bank, with the Founders Dinner Program open on her phone. The list of names looked clean and polite. That made it worse. Retiring the Past sounded gentle enough to print on thick paper and hand to donors with champagne. But Ruth knew what it meant now. Eddie, Keisha, and the others were not being honored. They were being staged for removal, and Claire had placed Ruth Vale among them. Ruth took screenshots of every page. Then she forwarded the email to Marlene and copied herself on a private account. She did not write a long explanation. She only added one sentence: They are turning forced separations into a public ceremony. Marlene replied within minutes: Do not respond to the sender. Preserve the original email. We will discuss. Ruth put the phone down and looked through the windshield. The bank's glass doors reflected the morning traffic behind her. She had done one important thing today. The account now carried a heightened verification flag. No one could quietly move signature authority without running into a wall. But Claire did not know that yet. Daniel might not either. For the first time, Ruth held information they did not. The power balance had shifted, but it did not feel satisfying. It felt lonely. She drove straight to Hartwell Senior Living. The lobby was busier than usual, filled with florists, event staff, and contractors carrying display boards. The place smelled of fresh paint and white roses, Claire's preferred scent for money. Ruth entered through the side corridor, but she did not hide, not today. Near the staff lounge, she found Keisha standing by a bulletin board, staring at a printed schedule. Keisha's face had lost its usual brightness. Keisha, Ruth said softly. Keisha folded the paper quickly. Morning. What happened? For a moment, Keisha looked toward the hallway, then she lowered her voice. They moved my review to tomorrow afternoon. Ruth felt a heaviness settle in her stomach. Did they say why? Brand alignment. Keisha gave a small, bitter laugh. I've worked front desk 9 years. Now suddenly I don't align. Ruth glanced at the paper in Keisha's hand. May I see? Keisha hesitated. Ruth did not push. Then Keisha handed it over. The form was short. Too short. It listed review categories with numerical ratings: guest presence, adaptability, energy, executive presentation readiness. At the bottom was a section labeled Recommended Transition Pathway. Ruth photographed it with Keisha's permission. Keep the original, Ruth said, and if they ask you to sign anything, take it home first. Keisha looked frightened. Can they fire me for that? They can pressure you. That doesn't mean you sign under pressure. Keisha studied Ruth's face. Why do you sound like you know what's coming? Ruth handed the paper back. Because I've learned to read polite words carefully. Before Keisha could ask more, Claire appeared at the end of the hall. She was walking with Daniel and 2 event planners, pointing toward the lobby with a rolled program proof in her hand. No staff clustering near guest areas this week, Claire said sharply. Though her voice stayed controlled, it creates anxiety. Keisha stepped back immediately. Ruth did not. Claire's eyes moved to her. Ruth, I thought I made my expectations clear. You did. Then why are you standing in a main corridor? Because I work here. Claire smiled as if Ruth had said something quaint. For now. Daniel's head turned toward Claire. There it was again, the flicker of discomfort, the almost protest. He said nothing. Ruth looked at him until he looked away. Claire tapped the program proof against her palm. We're very busy preparing for the founders' dinner. I don't have time for resistance disguised as confusion. I'm not confused, Ruth said. The event planners became very interested in their clipboards. Claire lowered her voice. You should be careful. Difficult employees rarely help themselves. Ruth felt Keisha tense beside her. That was the moment Ruth understood something important. Claire was not only threatening Ruth. She was performing power for anyone close enough to hear. Fear traveled faster when witnesses carried it away. Ruth spoke calmly. Threats sound different when people write them down. Claire's face changed, just enough. Daniel noticed too. What does that mean? Claire asked. It means people remember what is said to them. Ruth walked away before Claire could respond. She did not go to the laundry room. Instead, she went to the small maintenance office where Eddie was checking inventory. He looked up and immediately frowned. "You look like you know something. I know enough to tell you not to sign anything tomorrow." Eddie slowly set down his pen. "Tomorrow? They may call it a review. They may call it a transition. Take any paperwork home, ask for time, keep copies." Eddie stared at her for several seconds. "You're scaring me, Ruth. I'm trying to keep you from being cornered." His face softened and the fear underneath his tired humor finally showed. "I can't lose my insurance. My wife's treatment isn't cheap." Ruth had known his wife was ill, but hearing the quiet shame in his voice hurt. He looked down as if needing medical coverage were something embarrassing. "It isn't your fault," Ruth said. He laughed once. "Tell that to the people calling me expensive." Ruth touched the edge of the desk. She wanted to tell him everything, that she was not powerless, that Claire's plan could still be stopped, that the woman in the gray smock had more authority than anyone in that building imagined, but revealing too soon could ruin everything. "I'm meeting someone who can help," she said. "That's all I can say right now." Eddie nodded slowly. For once, he did not joke. By late afternoon, Ruth's phone buzzed with a call from Martin Reyes. She stepped outside into the rear courtyard before answering. "Mrs. Hartwell," Martin said. The formal name struck her after so many days of being Ruth Vale. "Martin, I received counsel's letter. I assumed you would." His exhale sounded tired. "Good, because I needed to tell you something before Claire controls the narrative." Ruth looked toward the staff entrance. "Go ahead." "The spending irregularities are worse than I first thought." Her grip tightened around the phone. "Define worse." "Brand consulting expenses routed through 3 vendors. 2 appear legitimate. 1 may be a pass-through. Payments increased after Claire took over donor-facing strategy." "Does Daniel know?" "I flagged summaries to him for months." That answer hit Ruth hard. "Summaries?" "Yes. Not full accusations, but enough to ask questions." "And did he?" A pause. "No." Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Martin continued. "There's also pressure to process several reimbursements before the founders' dinner closes out the quarter. I have not approved them." "Good. I need formal authority to hold them." "You'll have it," Ruth said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Martin lowered his voice. "There's one more thing. A revised program was circulated by mistake today. I saw it. Then you know about the legacy tribute." "Yes, it was Claire's idea." His tone hardened slightly. "But the removal list attached to it came from HR after Daniel's office signed off." Ruth stared at the gray sky above the courtyard. "Daniel's office? Again. Did Daniel personally approve it?" "I can't confirm that, but his office did." "Yes." The difference mattered legally. Emotionally, it barely helped. After the call, Ruth stood outside until the cold made her shoulders stiffen. Then she went back in through the service door. She did not cry. Crying would have to wait behind scanning, saving, calling, protecting. That evening, she drove not home, but to a small UPS store near her neighborhood. She printed copies of the founder's dinner program, Keisha's review form, the transition list, and Martin's email confirming the hold request. She mailed 1 sealed envelope to Marlene's office and sent another to her own P.O. box. Then she returned home and placed the bank confirmation in the lockbox at 9:18 p. Daniel called. She answered. "Mom, did you talk to Martin today?" Ruth stood very still. "Why? Claire says finance is suddenly refusing to process standard reimbursements. She thinks someone is interfering." "Are they standard?" Daniel sighed. "Please don't start." Ruth looked at Harold's photograph on the side table. "Daniel, did you approve the legacy transition list?" Silence. This time the silence lasted long enough to become its own confession. "Mom," he said finally, "you don't understand the pressure we're under." Ruth's voice became very quiet. "No, I understand pressure. I don't understand using applause to push people out the door." Daniel did not answer. Then another voice came through faintly in the background. "Claire, ask her if she sent the bank letter." Ruth's eyes narrowed. Daniel said nothing. Claire had not asked whether Ruth did it. She already knew. Ruth ended the call and immediately texted Marlene. "Claire knows about the bank letter. There may be someone informing her." A response came back almost instantly. "Then we move faster. Be at my office tomorrow at 8. Bring the trust originals." Ruth was at Marlene's office before 8. She carried the trust originals in a flat leather case Harold had bought decades ago, back when Hartwell still operated out of 2 cramped rooms above a physical therapy clinic. The case looked worn at the corners now, but the brass latch still closed firmly. Ruth liked that. Some things aged without becoming weak. Marlene's assistant took one look at Ruth and led her straight to the conference room. Marlene arrived moments later with 2 cups of coffee and a stack of printed emails. She did not waste time. Claire knowing about the bank letter means one of three things, Marlene said, Daniel told her. Someone at the bank violated discretion, or someone at Hartwell received notice through an internal channel and passed it along, which is most likely Daniel. Ruth looked down at the leather case. The answer hurt because it was simple. Marlene sat across from her, but we proceed based on proof, not pain. Ruth nodded. That was why she trusted Marlene. The woman never confused sympathy with strategy. They spent the next hour reviewing the trust documents page by page. Ruth controlled 52% through the Hartwell Family Trust. Daniel, as operating president, had broad daily authority but could not change payroll signatory structure, approve major asset sales, or alter executive compensation controls without Ruth's authorization. The protections were not decorative. They were enforceable. Marlene placed a yellow tab beside the signatory clause. This is the line Claire needs to get around. Ruth read it again, though she already knew the wording by heart. The acting trust signatory shall remain Ruth E. Hartwell unless written transfer, incapacity finding, or trustee resolution is properly executed in accordance with governing documents. Written transfer, incapacity finding, trustee resolution. Claire had tried the first with the false agreement. The banking inquiry hinted at the second. Ruth did not like where that path led. Marlene, she said quietly, could they use my surgery? They could try to suggest temporary incapacity or diminished availability. But surgery alone is not incapacity. Your doctor's records, physical therapy notes, and your own actions would matter. Still, if someone is building a paper trail around your health, we need to cut that off now. Ruth reached into her folder and removed Laura Chen's post-surgery restrictions. Marlene read them and gave one approving nod. Good, these show physical limitations, not cognitive ones. I asked for them yesterday. Smart. Ruth looked toward the window. Morning light reflected off the neighboring building. For a moment, she felt the strange sadness of having to prove she still understood her own life. Claire could insult her in hallways. Daniel could avoid her calls. But turning age and surgery into a weapon felt different. It felt like an attempt to shrink her legally. Marlene's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then opened an email on her laptop. This is from Martin Reyes. Ruth leaned forward. Marlene read silently, her face tightening as she moved down the page. What? He confirms finance has placed a temporary internal hold on Claire's pending reimbursements until authority questions are resolved. That's good, it is, but listen to this. Marlene scrolled. He also says Claire's office requested accelerated processing for several invoices connected to Founders Dinner branding. How much? Enough to require elevated review. Ruth's mouth went dry. And Daniel? His approval appears on 2 preliminary routing forms. Ruth closed her eyes, briefly, again. Daniel's name stood where judgment should have been. Can Martin stop them? He can delay. He cannot indefinitely block everything without formal board or trust action, then prepare formal trust action. Marlene looked at Ruth carefully. That is a major step, so is trying to erase my authority. For the first time that morning, Marlene almost smiled, not with pleasure, with recognition. There she is. Ruth did not smile back, but she felt steadier. Marlene began drafting a notice of restricted executive disbursement review. It would not accuse Claire of fraud. It would not make claims they were not ready to prove. It would simply require that certain categories of expenses, compensation adjustments, and payroll authority changes receive direct trust signatory review until further notice. Legal, boring, powerful. Ruth signed the instruction after reading every line. Her signature looked smaller than it had years ago, but still clear. Ruth Hartwell, no tremor. Marlene scanned the signed notice and sent it securely to Martin, the bank, and the company's registered counsel. Ruth watched it leave the screen and felt the quiet shift of a door closing before Claire could walk through it. Now, Marlene said, we need to discuss the Founders Dinner. Ruth sat back. I assume you saw the program. I did. Using a public tribute to announce separations is reckless. It is cruel. Yes, Marlene said, and potentially useful if they proceed. But I would rather stop harm than win later. So would I. Marlene tapped her pen once against the table. You have choices. We can quietly warn Daniel. We can notify the board chair. We can send a formal preservation letter to HR and finance. Or you can continue gathering until Claire overreaches publicly. Ruth thought of Eddie's face. Keisha's hands trembling around the review form. The list of names hidden behind soft language. I don't want them blindsided on stage, Ruth said. No decent person would. But if we stop Claire too early, she may hide the rest. Marlene nodded. That is the hard part. Ruth stared at the trust documents spread across the table. For years she had mistaken stepping back for kindness. She had believed Daniel needed space to become his own man, Maybe that had once been true, but now space had become cover, and cover had become danger. I want the preservation letter sent, Ruth said, to HR Finance and Company Counsel. Today. Require retention of all documents related to staff reviews, payroll authority, executive reimbursement, and the founder's dinner transition program. Marlene wrote it down. And Daniel? Ruth's throat tightened. Not Claire. Daniel. That choice hurt most because once Daniel received a preservation letter, he would know his mother no longer trusted informal conversations. He would know she had moved the conflict from family language into legal procedure. Maybe that was exactly what needed to happen. Send it to his office too, Ruth said. Marlene held her gaze. Are you sure? No, Ruth said, but do it. By noon, the letters were sent. At 12:18, Daniel called. Ruth let it go to voicemail. At 12:21, he called again. At 12:25, Claire called. Ruth did not answer either. Instead, she listened when Daniel's voicemail arrived. His voice was strained. Mom, why was Marlene sending legal notices to my office? Claire is furious. This makes us look unstable before the dinner. Please call me before this gets out of hand. Ruth saved the voicemail. Then Claire's message arrived as text. You are making a serious mistake. If you keep escalating this, Daniel will have no choice but to protect the company from you. Ruth stared at the words. Protect the company from you. There it was. The story Claire wanted to tell. Ruth was unstable. Ruth was difficult. Ruth was a threat. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she had stopped being manageable. She forwarded the message to Marlene. Then, for the first time, she replied directly to Claire. I will not discuss legal matters without counsel. The response came almost immediately. So that's how you want to play this? Ruth did not answer. At 3 o'clock, she drove to Hartwell. She entered through the front doors, not the service corridor. The lobby was full of workers setting up tall arrangements for the founder's dinner. White flowers, gold lighting tests. A large framed photograph of Harold had been placed near the entrance. Ruth stopped. Harold's picture was partially covered by a sponsor sign. She walked over and moved the sign herself. A young event assistant hurried toward her. Mom, please don't touch the display. Ruth looked at the photograph of her late husband, then at the assistant. This stays visible. The assistant hesitated, then stepped back. From the far side of the lobby, Claire saw. Her face tightened. Daniel stood beside her. This time, when Ruth looked at him, he did not look away, but he did not come toward her either. Ruth continued to the administrative wing and found Martin Reyes waiting near his office door. He looked pale but relieved. Mrs. Hartwell, he said quietly, thank you for the notice. Can you hold the reimbursements now? Yes, but there's more. He closed the office door behind them and lowered his voice. After Marlene's letter arrived, Claire's assistant canceled a meeting on my calendar. What meeting? Martin turned his monitor toward her. The canceled entry had no description, only a private tag. But the attachment remained in the archive. Ruth opened it. A draft agenda appeared. Emergency leadership discussion, Ruth Hartwell status. The first item read, consider temporary removal from premises pending review of disruptive conduct. Ruth read the agenda item twice. Consider temporary removal from premises pending review of disruptive conduct. The words sat there on Martin's monitor, plain and ugly. Not criminal, not dramatic, not a locked door in the middle of the night. Worse in some ways. It was the kind of corporate language that could make cruelty look like procedure. Martin stood beside her, silent. Ruth's first instinct was not fear. It was disbelief, followed by something sharper. They were preparing to remove her from her own building before the founder's dinner, not as Ruth Hartwell, not as the trust signatory, as Ruth Vale, the aging maintenance employee who had become inconvenient. Who drafted this? She asked. Martin clicked through the archived attachment properties. It came from Claire's office, shared with HR and legal distribution. Cancelled after Marlene's preservation letter hit. Was Daniel copied? Martin hesitated. That was answer enough. Show me. He opened the distribution list. Daniel's executive address appeared near the top. Ruth stared at it. Her son's name kept appearing beside things no son should have allowed. Layoff lists, transition programs, bank inquiries, removal agendas. Maybe Claire was using his office. Maybe Daniel skimmed instead of read. Maybe he had convinced himself that not knowing details kept him clean. But people were being hurt in the space created by his silence. Can you send this to Marlene? I already did while you were looking at it, Martin said. Ruth turned toward him. For the first time that day, she felt a small warmth of gratitude. Thank you. He nodded. There's another problem. Of course there is. Martin almost smiled, but it vanished quickly. If Claire feels cornered, she may try to frame the issue as workplace safety or disruption, not ownership, not authority, behavior. Ruth understood immediately a financial fight might require documents. A behavior complaint could move faster. She wants me escorted out before I can attend the dinner, Ruth said. That is my concern. Ruth looked through the office window toward the lobby. Event workers carried gold stands past Harold's photograph. Claire stood near the center of the room, one hand on her hip, directing people with that polished little smile. A woman rehearsing power. A woman unaware that power had started moving beneath her feet. Ruth turned back to Martin. Then I need to remain very calm. You already are. No, Ruth said, I mean visibly calm. Publicly calm, no raised voice, no private meeting without a witness, no hallway confrontation. Martin looked relieved. That would be wise. Ruth opened her purse and took out a small notebook. She wrote down the time, Martin's warning, and the agenda title. Then she wrote one more line. Claire may attempt removal before founder's dinner. Her handwriting looked firmer than she expected. When Ruth left Martin's office, she chose the main hallway. Not because she wanted attention, but because hiding now would help Claire's story. Disruptive people lurked. Guilty people avoided light. Ruth walked slowly, carefully, shoulder back, face composed. Claire noticed immediately. She left the florist she had been scolding and crossed the lobby. Ruth! Daniel stood behind her, speaking with one of the event coordinators. At Claire's tone, he turned. Ruth stopped in an open area near the reception desk, where cameras, staff, and event workers could see them. Yes? Claire's smile was smooth. I think it would be best if you went home for the day. Why? Because this environment seems to be upsetting you. Ruth felt Keisha's eyes lift from the desk. It doesn't upset me. Claire tilted her head. You've been meeting privately with finance. You've been upsetting staff. There are concerns. Whose concerns? Claire's smile flickered. Management concerns. Ruth looked toward Daniel. He was watching now, fully watching. Daniel, Ruth said, do you believe I have behaved disruptively today? His throat moved. Claire turned her head just enough to warn him without speaking. Daniel's eyes dropped for 1 second, then lifted again. I think everyone is under pressure, he said. It was not courage, but it was not agreement either. Claire's face tightened. Ruth nodded once. That wasn't an answer. A few feet away, Keisha pretended to organize papers. Her hands were still. Claire stepped closer and lowered her voice. Do not make me handle this formally. Ruth did not lower hers. If you have a formal complaint, put it in writing. The lobby went still in small waves. Not everyone heard every word, but enough heard the tone. Enough understood the balance had changed. Claire stared at her. For a moment, Ruth saw anger beneath the polish. Not annoyance, not irritation, anger. Then Claire smiled again. Fine, she said. We'll do things properly. She turned and walked away. Daniel remained where he was. Ruth did not wait for him to speak. She moved toward the staff corridor, slower than usual because her shoulder had begun to ache. Behind her, she heard Daniel say Claire's name, softly, uncertainly. Claire did not answer. The rest of the afternoon passed under a strange quiet. Staff avoided speaking openly, but their eyes followed Ruth. Eddie gave her a nod when she passed the maintenance office. Keisha slid a sealed envelope beneath the front desk toward Ruth as she passed. Ruth did not open it until she reached the supply room. Inside was a copy of Keisha's review schedule and a handwritten note. They told me not to discuss my review with anyone. They also asked if I had seen you acting confused or angry. Ruth's fingers tightened around the paper. There it was. They were not only preparing to remove employees, they were collecting character evidence against her. Ruth photographed the note immediately. Then she placed the original in the inner pocket of her purse. Her phones buzzed. Marlene, Ruth answered quietly. I have the removal agenda, Marlene said, and Martin's note. Keisha just gave me something else. Send it, Ruth did. Marlene called back 2 minutes later. They are building a conduct file. I know. I'm sending a letter now prohibiting retaliation, destruction of records, or interference with employee witnesses. It will go to company counsel and HR. Will that stop Claire? It may slow her down. It also creates a record if she continues. Ruth leaned against a shelf. She will continue. Yes, Marlene said. Then we prepare for that. After work, Ruth did not go home immediately. She drove to the original Hartwell building on Mayfield Road, the first residence she and Harold had opened before expansion made everything larger and colder. It was still part of the company, though now used for administrative training and short-term recovery suites. The parking lot was half full. The sign out front had been updated, but Ruth could still see the old stone foundation beneath the new facade. She went inside through the main entrance. A temporary event display stood near the lobby wall. It featured framed photos from Hartwell's history. Harold shaking hands with early staff, Ruth cutting the ribbon at the first opening, Daniel at a later expansion ceremony. Claire in newer photos, smiling beside donors. Ruth stepped closer. The ribbon-cutting photo had a caption beneath it, Harold Hartwell, founder. Ruth read it again. Only Harold. Her name was missing. She checked the next display. Another timeline panel described Harold's vision, Daniel's leadership, Claire's modernization. Ruth appeared in one photograph, unidentified, standing beside Harold like a guest. A cold sadness moved through her. This was not accidental. This was erasure. Slow, polished, public. Near the end of the display sat a draft plaque covered in protective film. It was titled The Future of Hartwell. Claire's name appeared in large letters, Daniel's beneath it. Harold's legacy was mentioned in a closing line. Ruth's was not there at all. She took photos of every panel. Then she stood in the quiet lobby and looked at the wall where, years earlier, she had hung the first framed license approval with her own hands. Her phone buzzed again, a text from Daniel. "Mom, Claire says you went to Mayfield. Please don't interfere with the heritage display. It's already approved." Ruth stared at the message. Already approved by whom? Before she could answer, another message arrived, this one from Martin. "I found the asset packet tied to Mayfield. Claire's office requested valuation estimates 2 months ago. Possible sale discussion after founders' dinner." Daniel copied. Ruth stood alone in the Mayfield lobby with Martin's message glowing on her phone. Possible sale discussion after founders' dinner. Daniel copied. For a moment, the room seemed too quiet. The old building held sounds differently than the newer facility. Footsteps echoed softer here. Voices carried warmth through the front hall. Even after renovations, Ruth could still remember where the first reception desk had stood, where Harold had argued with contractors over wheelchair access, where she had spent one late evening assembling chairs because the delivery company sent no crew. This building was not just property, it was proof that Hartwell had once been built by hands, not branding committees. Ruth photographed Martin's text, forwarded it to Marlene, then looked back at the heritage display. Harold's name remained. Daniel's leadership had been praised. Claire's modern vision had been polished into gold letters. Ruth had been reduced to an unnamed woman in a ribbon-cutting photo. She stepped closer to the timeline panel and read the caption again. Harold Hartwell opens Hartwell's first recovery residence. No mention of the woman who had signed the lease beside him. No mention of the nights Ruth spent interviewing staff, calling vendors and cleaning rooms because payroll was too tight to hire extra help. Her phone rang. Daniel. She let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Mom, where are you?" "At Mayfield." His breath caught. "Claire said you were interfering with the display. I moved a sponsor sign off your father's photograph. That's not what she meant. What did she mean?" A pause. Ruth could hear voices in the background. Claire was probably nearby. She always seemed to be nearby now, like a hand on Daniel's shoulder. Daniel lowered his voice. "This isn't the time to make symbolic gestures." Ruth looked at the timeline panel with her missing name. "You're right. It's time for honest ones. Mom, were you aware Claire's office requested valuation estimates for this building?" Silence. Ruth closed her eyes. She was beginning to know every shade of Daniel's silence. Confusion was quick. Shame was heavier. This one had weight. "You were copied," she said. "That doesn't mean I approved anything. That is not what I asked." His voice sharpened, but only from stress. "There are always valuation reviews. It's normal business. On the first building your father and I opened, please don't make this emotional." The words hit like a small, precise cut. Ruth looked around the lobby, the framed history, the covered plaque, the polished future with her erased from it. "It was emotional before it was business," she said. "That's why people trusted it." Daniel exhaled. "Claire thinks selling Mayfield could fund the new expansion wing. Claire thinks a lot of things. Mom, the company has to grow. At the cost of its memory?" He did not answer. Then Claire's voice came through faintly. "Tell her the board packet isn't final." Ruth's grip tightened around the phone. "The board packet," Ruth repeated. Daniel went quiet. "Goodbye, Daniel." She ended the call before he could explain the word final into something softer. The board packet existed. That meant the sale discussion was more than casual. Someone had prepared documents. Maybe not enough to execute anything, but enough to move a room of people toward a decision. Ruth walked to the small side office near the lobby, where a rotating administrator handled Mayfield's scheduling. A woman named Patrice looked up from her computer, surprised. "Can I help you?" Ruth knew Patrice only lightly, mid-40s, efficient kind when no one important was watching. "I need to know who approved the heritage display changes." Patrice hesitated. "I'm not sure I can. I'm asking as Ruth Hartwell." The name landed. Patrice's eyes widened slightly. For a few seconds she looked at Ruth with the same stunned recalculation Ruth had seen before. Same woman, different name, different treatment. I'm sorry, Patrice said quickly. I didn't realize. I know. That was the saddest part. Patrice opened a folder on her desktop. The display came from Claire's office. Marketing handled captions. We were told not to alter text without executive approval. Was there a draft with my name included? Patrice swallowed. Yes. Ruth felt the answer more than heard it. Can you show me? Patrice looked toward the hallway. Ruth's voice stayed calm. I'm not asking you to violate anything. I'm asking whether company history was changed. After a tense moment, Patrice turned the monitor slightly. A previous version of the timeline appeared. Harold and Ruth Hartwell opened First Recovery Residence. There it was, plain, accurate, removed. Ruth photographed the screen with Patrice's permission. The timestamp was visible in the file details. The edited version had been uploaded 3 days later. Edited by C. Whitcomb office. Ruth felt no triumph, only a deep sadness. Claire was not just preparing to push out older employees. She was rewriting the story so Ruth looked like she had never mattered. Thank you, Ruth said. Patrice's voice lowered. Mrs. Hartwell, there's something else. Ruth looked up. Patrice clicked another file. A facilities valuation request, Mayfield Road property, preliminary market analysis, possible post-event strategic disposition. The phrase strategic disposition was almost elegant enough to hide the ugliness. Ruth read the request line. Submitted by Claire Whitcomb, brand experience. Copied, Daniel Whitcomb, operating president, requested urgency. Prior to founders' dinner, Ruth took another photograph. Did anyone tour the building? She asked. 2 men from a commercial real estate firm came last month. We were told they were insurance consultants. Ruth's stomach tightened, a lie with a purpose. Do you remember the firm? Patrice wrote the name on a sticky note and handed it to her. Ruth placed it in her purse. She did not thank Patrice again because gratitude might make the woman more nervous. Instead, she simply said, "Keep copies of what you showed me, somewhere safe." Patrice nodded. When Ruth returned to the lobby, she stopped in front of Harold's photograph. This time, she did not touch the display. She did not need to. She had the proof. On the drive home, Ruth called Marlene from the car's hands-free system. Marlene answered with no greeting. I saw Martin's message. There's a board packet. I suspected as much. Claire removed my name from the heritage display. Patrice showed me the earlier version. A pause. Then Marlene said, send everything. I will when I get home. Also send the real estate firm name. Ruth glanced at the sticky note on the passenger seat. Already have it. Good. A valuation estimate doesn't create a sale, but combined with your removal, payroll control attempts, and rewriting founder history, it shows a pattern. A pattern. Ruth had lived inside the pain of each event separately. Marlene saw the shape. That was why help mattered. At home, Ruth scanned the sticky note, the photos, and her written summary. She uploaded everything into the secured folder, then placed physical copies in an envelope marked Mayfield. After that, she sat at her kitchen table with Harold's old fountain pen in front of her. For years, she had avoided using it. It had felt too much like touching his absence. Now she uncapped it and wrote a list. What must be protected? Staff, trust authority. Mayfield, truth, her own name. She stared at the final line for a long time. Her own name, it should not have required protection from family. At 8:46 p.m. An email arrived from Marlene. Ruth opened it immediately. Subject, urgent, draft board materials. Marlene's message was short. Martin obtained a partial board packet from archived routing. Review attached. Call me after reading page 14. Ruth opened the attachment. The packet was incomplete, but the pages that loaded were enough. Expansion projections, rebranding justification, labor efficiency, asset optimization. Then page 14. Strategic recommendation. Mayfield Road location to be prepared for potential sale following founders' dinner. Beneath it was a secondary recommendation. Remove remaining legacy barriers from operational decision-making. Ruth scrolled down. A note appeared in the margin. Ruth Vale issue to be resolved before public transition announcement. Use retirement tribute if possible. Security option if necessary. Ruth's hands went cold. They had not only planned to erase her, they had planned backup methods. Ruth did not call Marlene right away. She sat at the kitchen table with page 14 open on her laptop, reading the margin note until the words lost their shape and became only intent. Retirement tribute if possible. Security option if necessary. That was the part that stayed with her. Not the proposed sale, not even the removal of her name from company history. It was the calm preparedness of it. Claire had not simply hoped Ruth would go quietly. She had prepared for what to do if Ruth refused. Applause first, force second. Ruth printed the page and placed it beside the others. Then she took a photo of the screen with the file name visible, uploaded the attachment to her secure folder, and sent Marlene a short message. I read page 14. I am not going to the facility alone again. Marlene called within 2 minutes. Good, she said as soon as Ruth answered. That is exactly what I was going to tell you. Ruth looked toward the dark kitchen window. Her reflection looked pale but steady. Can they actually remove me? As an employee, they can ask you to leave a worksite under certain circumstances. As trust signatory and majority owner, it becomes much more complicated if they do it to interfere with governance, evidence, or protected activity. That is why witnesses matter. Then I need witnesses. Yes, and the staff needs warning. Marlene was quiet for a moment. Careful. We do not want anyone accused of organizing disruption before the dinner. I don't want a disruption. I want people not to be ambushed. That is fair. Keep it factual. No accusations you cannot support. Tell them to keep copies, not to sign under pressure and to request time. Ruth wrote those words down. Keep copies. Do not sign under pressure. Request time. Simple instructions. Sometimes dignity began with 3 simple instructions. The next morning, Ruth arrived at Hartwell with Marlene's paralegal, a calm woman named Denise Avery, who carried a leather notebook and introduced herself only as Ruth's document assistant. Denise was in her 40s, sharp, observant, and careful with her words. She did not look intimidating. That made her useful. Claire saw them enter through the front doors. Her expression flickered. Ruth watched the calculation happen. Claire wanted to object, but the lobby was full of vendors, staff, and event workers. She could not demand to know why an older maintenance employee had brought a professional-looking woman without creating the very scene she wanted to accuse Ruth of causing. So Claire smiled. Ruth, she called. I wasn't aware you were scheduled today. Ruth kept walking until they stood several feet apart in the open lobby. I am here to return some materials and complete my assigned shift. Claire's eyes moved to Denise. And your friend? Document assistant. For maintenance? For me. Claire's smile hardened. That seems unnecessary. Ruth said nothing. Denise opened her notebook and wrote down the time. Claire noticed. So did Daniel, who had just stepped out of the executive hallway. He stopped when he saw Denise. His face showed confusion first, then worry. Mom, he said quietly, what is this? Ruth looked at him. A witness. The word landed harder than she expected. Daniel's face changed. Claire laughed softly. That is an extremely dramatic way to describe a normal workday. Denise wrote again. Claire's eyes sharpened. Ruth turned away before the exchange could become more. Her shift began in the West Wing, but word traveled fast. By mid-morning, Keisha found an excuse to bring forms to the supply area. Eddie arrived 10 minutes later carrying a toolbox he did not need. 2 caregivers passed through separately, each lingering just long enough to hear Ruth speak in a low, calm voice. Do not refuse a meeting, Ruth told them. Do not argue in the room. Ask for copies of anything presented. Ask for time to review before signing. Write down who was present. Save messages. That is all. Keisha's eyes filled, but she blinked it back. Are we being fired? Ruth did not lie. I don't know, but I know you deserve not to be pressured. Eddie leaned against the shelf. You sound like a lawyer. Thankfully, I know one. That almost made him smile. One caregiver, a woman named Marisol, lowered her voice. They asked me yesterday if I had noticed you seeming confused. Denise's pen moved. Ruth held Marisol's gaze. What did you say? I said you seemed more organized than most executives upstairs. Eddie snorted. For the first time in days, a small laugh moved through the group. It did not last long, but it mattered. Fear hated witnesses. It hated humor even more. Before they separated, Ruth asked each person to send any written notices to a personal email account they controlled. Not company email, personal. She did not ask them to send anything to her. She wanted them protected, not exposed. That afternoon, Ruth went to the administrative copier room with Denise beside her. She copied her own work schedule, the staff review notice posted near HR, and a new memo that had appeared on the board. All staff are reminded that unauthorized discussion of internal transition planning may result in disciplinary review. There it was, a gag wrapped in corporate language. Ruth photographed it. Denise noted the time. As they left the copier room, Daniel was waiting in the hallway. He looked at Denise, then at Ruth. Can we talk alone? No. The answer came out gently, but it did not bend. Pain crossed his face. I'm your son. Yes, Ruth said. That is why this hurts. He looked away. For once, Claire was not beside him. That made the moment worse somehow. Without Claire's sharpness in the room, Daniel had no one to hide behind. I didn't know about the security option, he said. Ruth stayed still. The hallway noise seemed to fade. Then how do you know there is one? Daniel's eyes lifted to hers. Too late, he realized what he had admitted. Ruth felt the old maternal instinct rise in her. The urge to save him from the trap of his own words. The urge to soften the moment so he would not feel ashamed. She did not save him. Who told you? She asked. He rubbed both hands over his face. Claire mentioned it last night. She said it was only in case you caused a scene. A scene. She said you've been unstable. Ruth's voice remained level. Do I seem unstable to you? He looked at her then, really looked. At her neat coat, at Denise's notebook, at the folder in her hand. At the mother he had underestimated because she had allowed herself to be underestimated. No, he said quietly. It was the first useful truth he had given her. Ruth nodded once. Then decide what you plan to do with that knowledge. Before he could answer, Claire's voice cut through the hallway from behind him. Daniel, the donor seating call is starting. He flinched, just slightly, but Ruth saw it, so did Denise. Daniel turned halfway toward Claire, then back to Ruth. I have to go. No, Ruth said softly, you're choosing to go. His face tightened. He left anyway. That evening, Ruth and Denise walked out together through the front entrance. Claire watched from near the donor display but said nothing. Her silence was not surrender. It was storage. Claire was saving anger for a more useful moment. Ruth knew because she had begun to understand her. On the drive home, Ruth stopped at her P.O. box. Inside was a padded envelope from Martin. No return label, but she recognized his careful block handwriting. She opened it in the car. Inside was a printed email thread and a small handwritten note. Found this in archived routing. Thought you should see before Friday. Ruth unfolded the emails. The first message was from Claire to Daniel's office, sent 2 months earlier. If Ruth refuses transition, we need to question her capacity gently but firmly. Her surgery and emotional attachment to Harold's old building may help establish concern. Ruth felt the blood leave her face. Below it was Daniel's reply. Let's not go that far unless absolutely necessary. Not stop, unless absolutely necessary. Ruth read Daniel's reply 3 times. Let's not go that far unless absolutely necessary. The sentence was not a command. It was not an accusation. It did not sound cruel on the surface. That made it worse. Daniel had seen Claire suggest using Ruth's surgery and grief as tools to question her capacity, and he had not said no. He had only said not yet, not unless they needed to. Ruth sat in her car outside the P.O. Box building with Martin's envelope open in her lap. Traffic moved past the small strip mall. A delivery truck hissed at the curb. A woman in business clothes hurried past carrying coffee. Ordinary life continued around her, unaware that a mother had just discovered the exact price of her son's silence. She photographed the email thread, then placed the originals back into the envelope. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that. Trembling would have made her feel weaker than she was. She sent the images to Marlene with no message attached. This time, Marlene did not call immediately. Instead, a text appeared. Come tomorrow morning. We need to prepare for Friday, the founders' dinner. The date that had once been a celebration now felt like a deadline. Ruth drove home without turning on the radio. At the kitchen table, she spread the newest papers beside the others. Page 14, the capacity email, the bank confirmation, the review forms, the heritage display edits, the attempted resignation agreement, the reimbursement holds. The pattern no longer hid inside separate incidents. It had a shape now. Remove her from the floor, question her reliability, erase her history, move her signature authority, sell the first building, retire the older staff. And if she resisted, call her disruptive. Ruth took out Harold's fountain pen and wrote 1 line in her notebook. No private confrontation. Then another. No signature. Then a third. No disappearance. After a long while, she opened her phone and called Laura Chen, her physical therapist. The clinic had already closed, so Ruth left a message requesting a written summary of her current condition, treatment progress, and cognitive status if appropriate. She almost felt silly saying the last part, but Claire had turned medical vulnerability into a strategy. Ruth would answer with documentation. Next, she called her primary care office and requested an appointment note confirming she was managing her own affairs, attending appointments, and had no recorded cognitive impairment. The receptionist sounded confused but kind. Is this for insurance? No, Ruth said. It's for my protection. There was a pause. Then the receptionist softened. I'll mark it urgent for the doctor. After that, Ruth did something she had avoided for years. She opened the old contact list from Hartwell's early board years and found the name Robert Ellison. Robert had chaired the board before retiring to an advisory role. He had been Harold's friend, though never blindly loyal. If Harold was too sentimental, Robert challenged him. If Ruth was too cautious, Robert pushed her. He respected paper more than speeches and people more than titles. He answered on the 4th ring. Ruth Hartwell, he said, surprised. That is a name I haven't seen on my phone in too long. Hello, Robert. His tone changed immediately. What happened? She almost smiled. He had always been direct. I need to know whether you are attending the founders' dinner. Yes. Good. I may need you to listen carefully that night. Listen to what? Ruth looked at the stack of documents. The difference between a tribute and an execution. Robert said nothing for a moment, then quietly, bring me what I need to see. I will. The next morning, Ruth arrived at Marlene's office with 3 envelopes, 2 flash drives, and a medical records request form tucked into her purse. Denise was already there, organizing printouts. Marlene had the calm intensity of a woman preparing for a fight she intended to win without raising her voice. This email from Daniel is serious, Marlene said. Ruth sat across from her. It doesn't prove he wanted it. No, it proves he was aware of the strategy and did not reject it. That matters. Ruth looked at the table. I know. Marlene slid a document toward her. I drafted a formal notice to company counsel regarding improper capacity allegations. It states that any attempt to raise your health status as a governance issue must be supported by appropriate medical and legal evidence, not workplace speculation. Send it. I also drafted a letter to Robert Ellison and the Board Governance Committee, requesting that the Founders Dinner program not be used to announce personnel transitions or asset strategy. Ruth read the letter carefully. The language was restrained, no accusations, no drama, but every sentence carried weight. Send that too. Marlene nodded. There is one more decision. Ruth looked up. Do you plan to attend the Founders Dinner as Ruth Vale or Ruth Hartwell? The room went quiet. Ruth had not let herself ask the question directly. Ruth Vale was the woman Claire could dismiss, the woman listed in the retirement tribute. The woman security could escort out if Claire staged the right complaint. Ruth Hartwell was the woman whose name still controlled the trust. Both were her, but only one would stop Claire. I don't know yet, Ruth admitted. Marlene did not push. Then decide before Friday, not during. That afternoon, Ruth returned to Hartwell with Denise again. The facility buzzed with final preparations. Programs were being stacked in boxes. A seating chart stood near the entrance. Staff moved quietly, their tension hidden beneath professional habits. Eddie found Ruth near the west hallway. My review got moved, he said. To when? After the dinner. Ruth frowned. Keisha approached from the desk a moment later. Mine too. That should have felt like relief. It did not. Claire had delayed the reviews, meaning the legal letters had worked. Or Claire had changed tactics. Across the lobby, Claire stood speaking to Daniel. She held a phone against her ear, her posture rigid. When she saw Ruth, she ended the call. Daniel looked toward Ruth, too. This time there was no guilt in his face, only fear. Claire walked over alone. Denise opened her notebook. Claire ignored her. Ruth, I want to be very clear, she said. You are not to approach donors, board members, or press at the dinner. Ruth folded her hands in front of her. On what authority? Claire's eyes flashed. On the authority of protecting Daniel from the mess you are creating. There it was again. Daniel as shield, the company as excuse, Ruth as threat. I will not create a mess, Ruth said. I will attend if I choose to attend. Claire stepped closer and lowered her voice. If you show up as staff and try to embarrass this family, you will regret it. Denise's pen moved. Ruth's voice stayed calm. Was that a threat? Claire glanced at Denise, then smiled tightly. It was advice. Ruth nodded. Then I'll give you some advice too. Claire's smile vanished. Be careful what you sign when you don't know who signs above you. For a few seconds, Claire did not move. The words had entered the space between them like a locked door clicking shut. Then Claire laughed softly, but the sound did not reach her eyes. You really do think you're important. Ruth looked at the woman her son had chosen, the woman who had mistaken polish for power and silence for surrender. No, Ruth said quietly. I think you never asked why I didn't need to be. Claire's face changed, not fully, not enough, but for the first time Ruth saw uncertainty. That evening, Ruth went home and opened the garment bag at the back of her closet. Inside was a dark green suit she had worn the year Hartwell opened its 5th facility. Harold had told her it made her look impossible to ignore. She touched the sleeve, then she took it out and laid it across the bed. Her phone buzzed, a message from Robert Ellison. Received Marlene's letter. I reviewed the original trust summary. Ruth, why does the current Founders Dinner program list Claire as keynote for ownership transition remarks? Ruth stared at Robert Ellison's message while the dark green suit lay across her bed. Ownership transition remarks. The phrase did not belong anywhere near Claire's name. There was no ownership transition. There had been no vote, no trust resolution, no signed transfer, no legal process, and no conversation with Ruth. Yet the current program apparently gave Claire a stage to speak as if the future had already been handed to her. Ruth sat slowly on the edge of the bed. For the first time that week, she felt true fear, not fear of Claire's insults, not fear of being escorted out. Fear of how close they had come to creating a public story so polished that facts would have to fight their way back into the room. She typed back to Robert. There is no approved ownership transition. Please forward the program version you received to Marlene and me. His reply came moments later. Doing so, Ruth, this needs to be corrected before Friday. Ruth looked at Harold's fountain pen on the nightstand. Yes, she whispered to the empty room. It does. The program arrived in her inbox at 9:12 p.m. It was different from the version mistakenly sent to staff. This one had been labeled Board and Investor Draft. The design was more polished, the language more dangerous. Claire Whitcomb, Ownership Vision and Next Era Remarks. Daniel Whitcomb, Operational Leadership Forward. Ruth's name appeared nowhere, not even in the tribute section, not as founder, not as trust signatory, not as anything. Ruth forwarded the draft to Marlene with the subject line, "This is the real program." Then she called her. Marlene answered on the first ring. "I have it open." "Tell me I'm reading it wrong." "You are not." Ruth closed her eyes. Marlene continued, her voice controlled. "It avoids saying legal transfer, but the implication is obvious. Claire plans to present herself as future ownership authority, or at least leadership successor. Can she? Legally? No. Publicly? She can create confusion if nobody challenges it. Then we challenge it. Before or during?" Ruth looked at the green suit. "That is the question, isn't it?" Marlene was silent for a moment. "If we challenge before, they may cancel the remarks and hide the attempt. If we challenge during, the correction happens in front of the people being misled, and it will humiliate Daniel." "Yes." Ruth opened her eyes. That was the hardest part, not Claire. Claire had chosen her road step by step, but Daniel had wandered onto it by weakness, avoidance, and a marriage he seemed too tired to question. Public truth would not spare him. But private warnings had not stopped him either. "I want one more chance to speak to him," Ruth said. Marlene sighed softly. "With a witness?" "Yes. Public place, yes. No documents signed." "I know. And Ruth?" "Yes? Do not let him turn your love into delay." The sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. The next morning, Ruth sent Daniel a message. "Meet me at Hartwell Mayfield at noon, alone. If Claire comes, I leave." He did not respond for 20 minutes. Then okay. At 11:45, Ruth arrived at Mayfield with Denise waiting in the car outside. Not close enough to intrude. Close enough to witness Ruth arriving and leaving. The building felt quieter than it had the day before. The heritage display remained in the lobby, unchanged. Ruth did not touch it. Daniel arrived at noon exactly. He wore a gray suit and no tie. That detail nearly undid her. As an adult, he only skipped ties when he was anxious. Harold used to tease him for it, saying no man should fear a strip of fabric. Daniel stepped into the lobby and saw Ruth standing near the first ribbon-cutting photograph. His eyes moved to the caption, "Harold Hartwell, founder," then to Ruth's face. "I didn't approve that wording," he said quietly, "but you saw it." He rubbed his forehead. "I saw a draft. I didn't study every caption. That has become a theme." Pain crossed his face. Good, Ruth thought. Let it hurt. Some pain was information finally getting through. She pulled the board program from her folder and handed it to him. Daniel looked confused at first. Then he read Claire's keynote listing. His face changed. "What is this?" "The investor draft. I haven't seen this version. Robert Ellison has." Daniel's eyes lifted sharply. "Yes," Ruth said. "Robert is coming Friday." Daniel looked back at the page. "Ownership vision? That's not the same as ownership transfer. Then why does it need Claire?" He had no answer. Ruth took the page back. "Daniel, I need you to listen carefully. No interrupting. No managing. No telling me Claire is under pressure." He swallowed. "Okay, they tried to get me to sign a statement denying authority. They tried to question my capacity. They asked the bank about shifting payroll control. They prepared removal options if I refused to disappear. They removed my name from the history of this building. They drafted a program that implies an ownership transition that does not exist, and your name, your office, or your silence appears beside almost every step." Daniel's face drained slowly. "I didn't know all of that." "No," Ruth said. "You didn't want to know all of that." He looked away. The lobby clock ticked above the reception desk. For years, Ruth had softened truths for him. She did not do that now. "Your father trusted you because you cared about people," she said. "Not because you were perfect. Not because you were the loudest, because you cared. I don't know when you decided caring was less important than keeping peace with Claire." Daniel's eyes reddened. "Mom, no, you need to hear it." His mouth closed. Friday night, Claire plans to stand in front of board members, investors, donors, and staff and tell a story that erases me, pressures employees, and misrepresents the company's future. "I am asking you one time as your mother to stop her before I have to." Daniel looked down at the program. His hands trembled slightly. For one moment, Ruth believed he might finally do it. Then his phone rang. Claire. He looked at the screen and did not answer. It rang again. He silenced it. A small hope rose in Ruth's chest. Then Daniel said, "If I confront her now, she'll say you manipulated me." Ruth felt the hope fold in on itself. "Daniel, I'm not defending her." "You are. I'm trying to prevent a public disaster." "No," Ruth said softly. "You're trying to prevent discomfort." He flinched. The phone buzzed again with a text. He looked despite himself. Ruth did not need to see the message. She saw his face. Claire still had him. Maybe not fully, but enough. Daniel lowered the phone. "Give me until tomorrow morning." Ruth's chest tightened. Delay. Marlene's warning returned. "Do not let him turn your love into delay." "No." He looked startled. "No. If you intend to stop her, do it today." In writing, copy Marlene, Martin, Robert, and company counsel. Cancel the ownership remarks. Cancel the retirement tribute. Confirm no authority transitions exists today. Daniel stared at her. That would blow everything up. Ruth nodded. Yes. He looked at her like she had become someone he did not recognize. Maybe she had, or maybe she had finally returned. "I can't do that in one afternoon," he said. "Then I have my answer." She turned toward the door. "Mom, wait." Ruth stopped but did not face him. Daniel's voice broke slightly. "Are you going to expose us?" Ruth looked back. The word us told her almost everything. Not Claire. Us. He had tied himself to the lie so tightly he could no longer separate embarrassment from accountability. "I am going to correct the record," she said. "What that exposes depends on what you keep hiding." She left him standing beneath the photograph that should have named her. Outside, Denise stepped from the car and opened the passenger door without a word. Ruth appreciated the silence. By the time Ruth reached home, an email from Robert was waiting. "I spoke with 2 board members. They were told Friday includes a graceful transition away from legacy control." Who told them that? Ruth forwarded the email to Marlene and Martin. Then she opened her closet and looked again at the dark green suit. This time she did not hesitate. She took it to the tailor down the street for pressing, then stopped at the bank and placed her originals in a safe deposit box. She kept only certified copies with her. At 6:04 p.m., Daniel finally sent a message. "I need more time." Ruth read it once. Then she set the phone down and called Marlene. "I've decided," Ruth said. Marlene did not ask what. She already knew. "I'm attending as Ruth Hartwell." Ruth did not sleep much that night. She lay awake with the dark green suit hanging on the closet door, pressed and ready, looking less like clothing and more like a decision. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's message again. "I need more time." For years, Ruth had given him time. Time to grieve, time to lead. Time to grow into the kind of man Harold believed he could become. But time had not made him braver. It had only given Claire more room to build her version of the company around his silence. By morning, Ruth felt tired but not uncertain. She dressed slowly. The suit fit better than she expected. The tailor had pressed the seams sharply, and the fabric held its shape across her shoulders. Her surgery scar pulled slightly when she fastened the jacket, but the pain felt distant now, like something belonging to another woman. On the dresser sat 2 sets of identification. Ruth Vale's employee badge, Ruth Hartwell's trust credentials. She picked up the employee badge first. The plastic card was worn at the edges from months of use. It had opened service doors, laundry rooms, staff corridors, and the invisible spaces where people told the truth because they thought no one powerful was listening. Then she picked up the trust credentials and placed them in her purse beside certified copies of the ownership summary, Marlene's letters, the bank confirmation, and Robert's email. Ruth Vale had gathered the truth. Ruth Hartwell would carry it into the room. At 10, Marlene arrived at Ruth's townhouse with Denise and a slim black portfolio. Ruth opened the door before they knocked twice. Marlene looked her over and nodded once. Harold would approve. Ruth's throat tightened, but she did not let emotion slow her. "What do we have?" Robert confirmed he will be at the dinner and has spoken with 2 board members. Martin will attend as CFO. The bank has acknowledged the heightened verification flag in writing. Company counsel has received our notices. And Claire? Still listed as giving ownership vision remarks. Ruth absorbed that quietly. She's going forward. Yes. Denise placed the portfolio on the kitchen table and opened it. "We prepared packets, not for broad distribution, only if needed." Ruth looked through the contents, trust summary, payroll authority clause, founder documentation including Ruth's name, bank protection letter, preservation notices. Program discrepancies, clean organized, undeniable. Marlene touched one page, no accusations beyond what documents support. "If Robert corrects the record, keep your statement short." Ruth looked up. "If? Public events are unpredictable." "No," Ruth said softly. "Claire is predictable." That was what made the evening dangerous. Claire would smile. She would glow beneath the lights. She would speak in polished phrases and invite the room to believe she represented the future. and if Ruth waited too long, some people would. At 4:30, Ruth received one final message from Daniel. "Mom, please don't come tonight looking for a confrontation. I'm begging you." Ruth read the message in the hallway while Marlene waited near the door. She typed back slowly, "I am not coming for confrontation. I am coming for the truth." Then she turned off message notifications. The founders' dinner was held in the main Hartwell facility, inside the event hall that had once been a rehabilitation gym before Claire redesigned it into something almost unrecognizable. By the time Ruth arrived, the building glowed with warm lights and carefully arranged flowers. Valets moved cars through the circular drive. Guests in tailored suits and evening dresses gathered near the entrance. Ruth stepped out of the car with Marlene beside her and Denise a few feet behind. The first person who recognized her was Keisha. She stood near the front desk in formal black attire, greeting guests with a name list in hand. When she saw Ruth, her eyes widened. "Ruth?" Then her gaze dropped to the suit, the pearls, the posture. "Mrs. Hartwell," Keisha whispered. Ruth placed a hand briefly over Keisha's. "Not so loud yet." Keisha swallowed and nodded, but her eyes shone with sudden understanding. Inside the lobby, Harold's photograph had been uncovered fully. Ruth noticed that immediately. Someone had moved the sponsor sign away again. Perhaps Robert, perhaps Martin, perhaps one of the staff. She did not know, but the sight steadied her. Then Claire saw her. She stood near the entrance to the event hall in a silver dress, greeting donors with practiced warmth. Daniel stood at her side, pale beneath the lights. When Claire's eyes landed on Ruth, her smile faltered for only a second. Only a second. But Ruth saw fear. Claire crossed the lobby quickly. "Ruth," she said under her breath. "What are you doing?" "Attending. This is not appropriate." Ruth looked around at the guests, the staff, the framed history, the company her hands had helped build. "I disagree." Claire's eyes flicked to Marlene. "You brought your attorney to a family event?" "No," Ruth said. "I brought counsel to a corporate event." That distinction landed. Daniel approached then, his voice low. "Mom, please." Ruth looked at him. "Did you correct the program?" His silence answered. Marlene opened her portfolio but did not remove anything. Claire noticed the movement. "This is harassment." Ruth's voice stayed even. "No, Claire. This is documentation." A photographer lifted his camera nearby. Claire instantly changed her face, smoothing panic into a smile. "We'll discuss this later." "No," Ruth said. "We won't." Claire's smile froze. Before she could respond, Robert Ellison entered the lobby from the event hall. He was tall, silver-haired, and still carried himself like a man whose calm made louder people nervous. His eyes found Ruth immediately. He crossed to her and took both her hands. "Ruth Hartwell," he said clearly, "it is good to see you where you belong." Several heads turned. Claire's face drained of color. Daniel stared at Robert as if the floor had shifted beneath him. Robert turned toward the event hall. "We should go in. I believe there are some corrections to make before the program begins." Claire stepped forward quickly. "Robert, the program is already finalized." Robert looked at her politely. "No," he said. "It isn't." The event hall doors opened wider, releasing music, conversation, and warm golden light. Ruth could see the stage at the far end. Behind the podium, the large screen already displayed the evening's first slide. Claire Whitcomb, Ownership Vision, and Hartwell's Next Era. Robert's jaw tightened. Then, from the side of the stage, Martin Reyes appeared, holding a folder and looking directly at Ruth. He gave one short nod. Ruth understood. The payroll documents were ready. Ruth felt the weight of the room shift the moment she saw Martin holding that folder. Not because the evidence would end everything tonight. It would not. Real betrayals rarely collapsed in a single evening. But for the first time since Harold's death, Claire no longer controlled every piece of the board. The doors to the event hall remained open as guests streamed inside. Conversations continued, but a current of curiosity had begun to spread. People had seen Robert greet Ruth. They had seen Claire lose her composure. They had noticed Daniel standing silently between them. Claire recovered first. "Everyone is waiting," she said tightly. "We can discuss any concerns after the presentation." Robert smiled without warmth. "That depends on what is presented." Claire's jaw tightened. Ruth said nothing. Silence had become one of her strongest tools. She no longer felt obligated to rescue other people from the consequences of their own decisions. The group entered the hall. Round tables filled the room beneath soft lighting. Donors, executives, board members, and longtime supporters occupied nearly every seat. At the front stood a stage framed by photographs documenting decades of rehabilitation programs, community partnerships, and company growth. Harold appeared in many of them. Ruth did not. That omission hurt more now than it had before. Not because she needed recognition, because she could finally see how deliberate the erasure had been. As she moved toward her assigned table, Martin approached discreetly. "The payroll records are secure," he said quietly. "Any problems?" His expression darkened. "More questions." That caught her attention. "What kind of questions?" Martin glanced toward Claire before lowering his voice further. The compensation issue wasn't isolated. Ruth felt her pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" "It means I found additional approvals linked to executive authorization. Some are unusual." "Unusual how?" "I don't want to speculate before verification." That answer frustrated her. It also frightened her, because Martin was not a man who used cautious language unnecessarily. Before Ruth could ask more, an event coordinator signaled that the program was beginning. Martin stepped away and left her with a new uncertainty. The lights dimmed. A polished video filled the large screen. Music played. Images flashed across decades of company history. Harold appeared repeatedly. Founding meetings, ribbon cuttings, community awards, expansion projects. The audience applauded several times. Then the video ended. Claire walked onto the stage. Confident, elegant, prepared. The applause that greeted her was strong. Ruth watched Daniel instead. He sat rigidly at a nearby table. His hands remained clasped. His eyes never reached the stage. Claire began smoothly. She thanked donors, recognized partners, praised staff, spoke about innovation and future growth. Every sentence sounded polished. Every smile looked practiced. For several minutes, she controlled the room completely. Then she reached the section Ruth had been waiting for. "The Hartwell mission has always been about responsible leadership," Claire said. Building on the vision passed forward through generations, a slide appeared behind her. "Future leadership structure," Claire continued speaking, but Robert stood before she could finish. The interruption was small, a simple movement, yet it instantly commanded attention. Conversations stopped. Claire froze. "Robert?" she said. "I apologize," he replied. "Before we continue, there is a factual correction that should be made." The room became silent. Claire forced a laugh. "I think we can save questions until this is not a question." The laughter disappeared. Robert looked toward the audience, then toward Ruth. "Tonight's program references continuity of ownership and leadership. Certain descriptions may unintentionally create confusion." The screen behind Claire still displayed her title slide, Ownership Vision. The phrase suddenly seemed dangerous. Robert continued calmly. "The Hartwell Family Trust remains the controlling owner of this organization." Several board members exchanged glances. Claire remained motionless, and the acting trustee is present tonight. Every eye turned toward Ruth. The room did not erupt, it simply changed. People sat straighter, looked harder, recalculated. Power often shifted quietly before it shifted loudly. Claire's smile finally cracked. "Robert," she said carefully, "I don't think this is the appropriate venue." "I disagree." Her eyes flashed. Ruth could almost see the calculations happening behind them. How much did Robert know? How much did Martin know? How much had Ruth discovered? Claire had always relied on uncertainty. Now uncertainty belonged to everyone else. Robert gestured toward Ruth. "Mrs. Hartwell deserves acknowledgement." Polite applause began, then grew stronger. Ruth remained seated. She had spent months being ignored by people who suddenly remembered her existence. The applause felt less satisfying than she had imagined. Because Daniel wasn't clapping, he simply sat there staring at the table. The program moved forward awkwardly. Claire finished her remarks, but the confidence was gone. Questions from donors became sharper. Board members requested clarification on governance. Someone asked about founder succession planning. Someone else asked about trust oversight. Claire answered, yet every response sounded thinner than the one before. By the time dinner service began, she had lost control of the narrative. Not completely, but enough for people to start asking questions, enough for people to start looking elsewhere, enough for fear to enter her eyes. An hour later, Ruth stepped into a side hallway outside the ballroom. She needed air. The evening had exhausted her more than she wanted to admit. Her recovery remained incomplete. Stress settled heavily into her muscles. She leaned briefly against the wall, then she heard voices. "Daniel." "Claire." The conference room door down the hallway stood slightly open. Ruth stopped moving, not because she intended to eavesdrop, because Daniel sounded angry, truly angry. "For the first time in months, you told me everything was clean." Claire's voice followed immediately. "It is." "No." A sharp pause. "You said payroll issues were administrative." "They are." "You said my mother had nothing." Ruth's heart slowed. Every word suddenly mattered. Claire answered carefully. "She doesn't have operational control. That's not what I asked." The silence stretched. Then Daniel spoke again. "What else haven't you told me?" For one brief moment, Ruth almost opened the door, almost walked inside, almost demanded answers, but but she stopped herself. Emotion was exactly what Claire expected. Evidence mattered more. The conversation continued. Lower now, harder to hear. Then a single sentence reached her clearly. Claire said, if they find the Riverside documents, everything becomes complicated. Ruth froze. Riverside. She had never heard that name before. Not once. No property, no project, no subsidiary, nothing. Daniel immediately responded. What Riverside documents? Another silence, longer this time. Too long. When Claire finally answered, her voice had dropped below what Ruth could hear. A door closed, footsteps approached. Ruth moved away before either of them emerged. Her mind raced. Riverside. What was Riverside? A property? A company? An account? A debt? The answers mattered because Claire had sounded genuinely afraid. More afraid than when Robert interrupted her speech. More afraid than when ownership was publicly corrected. Whatever Riverside was, it existed deeper inside the structure she had built. Later that evening, guests began leaving. The event had survived, barely, but the atmosphere was different from what Claire had planned. People were talking. Questions were spreading. Doubt had entered rooms where certainty once lived. As Ruth prepared to leave, Martin found her again. This time he looked troubled. Something happened. What? He handed her a folded sheet of paper. No copies. This was left in my office mailbox this afternoon. Ruth unfolded it. The document appeared to be a property-related filing. Not complete, only a partial photocopy. Several sections had been cut off. But one detail remained visible. Her breath caught. The signature line. The document carried Harold Hartwell's signature, or something that looked very much like it. The date beneath it was as impossible. It had been signed nearly 7 months after Harold's death. At the bottom corner, barely visible through the poor copy quality, sat a word stamped across the page. Riverside. Ruth stared at it, and for the first time all evening she felt genuinely afraid. Ruth did not sleep that night. The partial Riverside document sat beside her hotel bed along with copies of payroll records, trust documents, and months of notes she had quietly collected. By sunrise, the pieces no longer felt separate, they felt connected, not as one dramatic conspiracy but as a pattern. A pattern of small decisions made by people who assumed she would never look closely. Over the next 6 weeks, lawyers, auditors, and compliance specialists did exactly that. They looked closely. The Riverside documents turned out to be neither a secret property nor a hidden inheritance. They were far more practical and far more dangerous. Riverside was the internal name of a restructuring project Claire had launched almost 2 years earlier. Officially, it was presented as an efficiency initiative. Unofficially, it became the vehicle through which several expenses had been misclassified, executive spending had been hidden inside operational budgets, and employee reduction plans had been developed using criteria that exposed the company to significant legal risk. The forged signature was not part of a completed transaction. It had appeared on draft authorization paperwork that should never have carried Harold's name at all. That discovery alone did not create criminal charges, but it triggered deeper scrutiny, and deeper scrutiny revealed more. Expense accounts tied to executive projects had been routed through departmental budgets. Luxury consulting fees had been classified as workforce development. Travel expenses had been buried inside training allocations. Several planned layoffs disproportionately targeted older employees, despite performance records that contradicted the stated rationale. None of it looked like one massive theft. It looked like something more believable. Years of arrogance. Years of assuming nobody would ask questions. Years of believing appearances mattered more than accountability. The board commissioned a full independent review. Claire fought at first, then she stopped. Ruth understood why the moment she saw the attorney's recommendation. The evidence no longer depended on witnesses. It depended on records. Records Claire could not explain away. 3 days before the termination review hearing, Claire submitted her resignation. The announcement reached employees before lunch. Shock spread quickly, not because everyone loved Claire, because many had assumed she would always survive. People like Claire usually did. For a moment, Ruth felt something she had imagined many times during the worst months. Vindication. Then the feeling faded, because the company still remained. The employees still remained. The damage still remained. Destroying Claire was not the same thing as repairing what she had broken. Several weeks later, a negotiated legal settlement was finalized. Claire agreed to repay a substantial portion of improperly classified expenses and accepted restrictions that effectively ended her path to senior leadership positions within the industry. No dramatic courtroom scene followed. No public humiliation, no handcuffs, just consequences. The kind that stayed, the kind that appeared every time a future employer reviewed her record. the kind that could not be hidden behind presentation slides and polished speeches. Daniel attended every board meeting during the process. At first, many directors wanted him removed entirely. Some argued he had ignored warning signs. Others believed his loyalty to Claire had compromised his judgment. They were not entirely wrong. Daniel never tried to defend himself. That surprised Ruth. He listened, accepted criticism. Read reports he should have read years earlier. For once, he stopped asking people to trust him and started proving he deserved it. The board eventually allowed him to remain with strict oversight measures and reduced authority. It was not a reward. It was a final opportunity. Whether he would earn it remained his responsibility. One afternoon, he visited Ruth alone, not at the company, at her home, the home she still owned, the home they had nearly taken from her. She opened the door and found him standing quietly on the porch, older than he had seemed only months before, more tired, more honest. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Good." The answer startled him. Ruth did not soften it. "You should understand the difference." Daniel lowered his eyes. She invited him inside anyway, not because everything was repaired. Because boundaries and bitterness were not the same thing. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once reviewed bills while recovering from surgery. The same table where she had first begun noticing missing information. The same table where she had decided silence could become strategy. "I should have listened," Daniel said. "Yes, I believed what was easier." "Yes." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was protecting the company." Ruth studied her son for a long moment. Then she spoke carefully. "No, you were protecting your comfort." The words landed harder because they were true. Neither of them argued. When he finally left, nothing miraculous had happened. The relationship remained damaged. Trust remained fragile. But for the first time in years, it rested on honesty instead of illusion. That was enough. The reforms took months. They were not exciting. They did not create headlines. But they mattered. Benefits that had been quietly reduced were restored. Review procedures were rewritten. Age-neutral evaluation policies became mandatory. Executive expense approvals required multiple levels of transparency. Senior leadership began participating in operational rotations several times each year. Managers who made decisions about employees would now spend time working alongside them. Not for appearances, for understanding. Ruth insisted on that. The board listened, partly because she controlled the trust, partly because she had earned their respect, mostly because the audit had proven she had been right. She stopped working undercover soon afterward. There was no reason to continue. Everyone knew who she was now, yet she still visited facilities, still sat with staff during breaks, still asked questions, still listened. The difference was simple. Nobody looked through her anymore. One morning, nearly a year after the Riverside documents surfaced, Ruth walked through the rehabilitation center where the entire journey had truly begun. Several employees greeted her by name. Others waved from down the hallway. The warmth felt different now, not because they knew she had authority, because they knew she had used it to protect them. That distinction mattered. Respect built on fear never lasted. Respect built on action did. Later that afternoon, she sat in a conference room overlooking the campus. Sunlight filtered through the windows. A stack of documents waited before her, the final approval package for the annual retention initiative. Martin sat nearby. Robert occupied the chair across from her. Neither man rushed her. Neither needed to. The recommendation had already been reviewed, verified, budgeted, ready. Ruth opened the folder. Near the bottom sat the authorization page. She studied it quietly. A year earlier, executive signatures had approved vanity expenses, hidden classifications, and plans that treated loyal employees like numbers. Now the signature before her authorized retention bonuses for staff members who had stayed through uncertainty and reform. Receptionists, technicians, custodians, nurses, administrators, people who had carried the organization while others chased prestige. Ruth picked up the pen. For a moment she thought about Harold, not with anger, not with regret, only with clarity. Then she signed. The ink settled across the page. Simple, final. Her authority had returned, her home remained hers, her voice belonged to her again. The greatest victory was not Claire's resignation, the audit findings, or the legal settlement. It was that Ruth no longer needed anyone's permission to matter. Outside the conference room, employees continued moving through their day. Phones rang, doors opened and closed, work continued, life continued, and that felt exactly right. Because real power was never about revenge. It was about protecting what mattered without becoming cruel yourself. Have you ever been judged by appearance or taken for granted by your own family? And if you were Ruth, would you forgive from a distance or never look back at all?